The sky above the atoll was a pale wash of blue and gray, pierced only by the screaming shriek of dive bombers plummeting from seemingly impossible altitudes. The ocean below rippled in chaotic patterns, each wave reflecting sunlight off the scattered columns of smoke and fire erupting from the decks of the Japanese carriers. Engines roared, wings shivered, and the scent of burning metal, aviation fuel, and salt water hung in the air, invisible but palpable. From above, the aircraft moved as if in slow motion, a ballet of impending destruction. Bombs left their cradles, descending in measured arcs toward the fleet that had so confidently steamed forward hours before. Every drop was calculated, every strike predetermined by weeks of planning, code-breaking, and meticulous reconnaissance. Below, the decks of the Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, seemed impossibly calm at first glance. Sailors scurried between turrets and deck equipment, unaware, for just a heartbeat, of the scale of devastation about to meet them. Flak guns opened sporadically, staccato bursts scattering white-hot fragments into the air. Pilots in the air twisted, rolled, and dove, a deadly choreography of steel and courage. A single bomb slammed into the flight deck of Kaga. The explosion threw flame into the air, sending splinters of wood and twisted metal hurtling skyward. Sailors, thrown clear, clawed for purchase against the deck rails. The fire leaped upward, licking the rigging and superstructure, consuming life and machinery alike. In the carrier Akagi, bridge officers froze, shock crystallizing across their faces. Flags fluttered uselessly in the smoke-choked wind. The roar of approaching aircraft, dive after dive, left their communications fragmented, orders shouted but barely heard over the metallic wail of engines and detonations. Each attack compounded the terror, an endless cascade of fire and noise. Above, the American dive bombers maintained their glide, the pilots' faces etched with tension beneath their helmets. They observed, detached yet hyper-aware, the meticulous unraveling of the Japanese formations below. Every strike confirmed the calculations, every explosion affirmed the strategy, every carrier that erupted in flame a testament to months of unseen work in the shadowy halls of intelligence. Soryu went down next. A bomb tore through her deck, igniting fuel stores, cascading into hangar spaces crowded with aircraft and personnel. Sailors tried to man guns, fight the blaze, and save comrades, but chaos had overtaken reason. The weight of the fire, the sound of the engines, the human screams, all combined into a singular sensation of inexorable doom. On the decks of Hiryu, Japanese pilots prepared to take off, unaware that the last coordinated strikes would meet them mid-air with equal force. Smoke curled into the sky, mingling with the vapor trails of the American dive bombers, creating an almost surreal haze that stretched from the ocean to the clouds. Each maneuver, each evasive turn, was too little, too late. The carriers were already marked, already condemned. From the American perspective, even as destruction unfolded, there was a deliberate rhythm. Pilots climbed, dove, released, and pulled away, observing the precise cascade of effects. Thousands of soldiers, tens of thousands of tons of steel, were undone in minutes, not by brute force alone, but by foresight, timing, and calculation honed in silence before the battle. By the time the smoke cleared over the shattered decks, 4 Japanese carriers lay burning, listing, or already slipping beneath the waves. Sailors and pilots who had moments before moved with confidence were now survivors, floating in the ocean, stunned, unable to comprehend the sudden, almost surreal annihilation. Across the atoll, the psychological shock rippled through every echelon. The flag bridges, the fighter rooms, the hangars, all awash in disbelief and horror. And above it all, the American pilots began to regroup, engines screaming, wings battered by flak, but minds still calculating the next move. In that slow-motion tableau, the scale of victory and the weight of devastation hung in the air together, suspended between courage and terror, between precision and chaos, as the Battle of Midway turned inexorably toward history. Weeks before the deafening explosions over Midway, the Pacific was a theater of quiet tension. Admiral Chester Nimitz, stationed in the command rooms of Pearl Harbor, traced lines on maps, his fingers hovering over the coordinates of the Japanese fleet. Every intercepted message, every subtle shift in patrol patterns, whispered secrets that only trained minds could interpret. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto moved with confident precision. On the decks of his flagship, He oversaw the preparation of the 4 carriers that would soon dominate the Pacific sky: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Sailors drilled with unerring efficiency, aircraft were loaded, torpedoes and bombs secured, and the crew's morale radiated a sense of inevitable victory. American cryptographers, hunched over tables littered with fragments of Japanese code, worked silently to piece together the movements of this formidable force. In the cool, dimly lit rooms of Station HYPO, they decoded transmissions that revealed not just locations, but intentions. Each breakthrough chipped away at the armor of Japanese secrecy, laying bare the coming storm. The psychological tension on both sides was palpable. In the U.S. fleet, pilots prepared for a mission they knew could be decisive yet fatal. They practiced dive drills, coordinated formations, and ran simulations over maps and models, understanding that the coming days would demand absolute precision and courage. On the Japanese side, officers believed they were orchestrating a masterstroke, a trap designed to draw the remaining American carriers into destruction. Confidence infused every decision. Sailors and airmen carried out orders with the belief that victory was predetermined, unaware that the invisible hand of intelligence was already turning the tide against them. The fleets moved silently across the vast Pacific, each unaware of the other's knowledge. Clouds hung over the ocean like gray omens, the sun glinting off waves that would soon be streaked with smoke and fire. Every ship, every pilot, every sailor existed in a suspended reality. Calm, precise, but on the edge of catastrophe. American commanders knew the stakes. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance balanced aggression with caution, aware that even the slightest miscalculation could cost hundreds of lives and allow Japan to maintain dominance. Meanwhile, U.S. dive bomber and torpedo squadrons rehearsed approaches and release points, building muscle memory that would be tested under fire. On the Japanese side, the psychological pressure of expectation weighed heavily. Officers expected perfection, pilots expected to dominate, and sailors expected a swift, decisive battle. Yet beneath the confidence lay an unacknowledged vulnerability, an invisible crack in the facade that American intelligence had already begun to exploit. As the fleets converged, the calm before the storm stretched thin. The horizon shimmered, betraying nothing of the chaos to come, yet every observer, every pilot, and every officer carried within them the unspoken awareness that history was about to pivot. This prelude, rich in planning, calculation, and psychological tension, set the stage for the dramatic, catastrophic events over Midway, where thousands would fall and 4 carriers would be extinguished in a single, decisive blow. Before any bombs fell, before any dive bombers carved their deadly arcs toward the Japanese carriers, the war was being fought in quiet rooms filled with tables, charts, and the soft hum of concentration. In the bowels of Pearl Harbor, Station HYPO hummed with a nervous energy that few outside its walls could comprehend. Cryptographers hunched over fragments of intercepted Japanese messages, translating, comparing, and analyzing patterns that, if interpreted correctly, could change the course of the Pacific War. Joseph Rochefort, the legendary leader of the team, moved among them like a conductor guiding a symphony. His eyes scanned codes and diagrams, searching for subtle irregularities, inconsistencies, and patterns hidden in the vast sea of JN-25, the complex, unciphered Japanese naval code. Every day, hours of meticulous labor brought them closer to a revelation that could overturn the Japanese advantage. The breakthrough came not with fanfare but with quiet clarity. A small message indicated the target AF, ambiguous, yet familiar to Rochefort and his team. By orchestrating a ruse involving fake water supply reports from Midway Island, they tricked the Japanese into confirming that AF indeed referred to Midway. The silent confirmation rippled through the room like a secret thunderclap. The team had unlocked the location of the trap before Japan even knew America knew. On the American carriers, the intelligence filtered through channels like an invisible tide. Commanders studied the decrypted reports with grim intensity. Nimitz, Spruance, and Fletcher realized that the Japanese were sailing not just into a battle but into a preordained ambush. Every calculation, flight deck spacing, approach angles, timing of torpedo and dive bomber runs, could now be informed by knowledge that the enemy considered unknowable. Meanwhile, Japanese officers moved under a false sense of confidence. Their fleet, meticulously prepared, moved in formations designed to dominate. The psychological certainty of victory permeated every decision. Deck crews prepared aircraft, pilots reviewed attack procedures, and admirals mapped out the destruction of what they assumed were the remaining American carriers. Yet this confidence, unchallenged and untested, was about to be shattered. The dual narratives, the invisible intelligence war on one side and the meticulous preparations on the other, created a tension that stretched across the Pacific. Every day of travel toward Midway brought both fleets closer to the collision point, each unaware of the exact hand the other held. For the Americans, confidence mixed with anxiety. They knew what the Japanese expected, yet they could not predict the chaos of battle itself, the human errors, the fog of war, and the unpredictability of chance. Yet every pilot, sailor, and officer carried the knowledge that they were positioned to strike with precision, that the scales had tilted in ways Japan would never foresee. On the Japanese carriers, psychology was a silent weapon and a silent weakness. Officers expected flawless execution, and sailors believed in inevitable victory. This psychological overconfidence, paired with a lack of awareness of American code-breaking capabilities, made the fleet brittle, vulnerable, and tragically blind to the storm waiting over Midway. In these quiet hours before battle, the war had already begun, not with guns, bombs, or explosions, but with knowledge, calculation, and the invisible threads of strategy that would turn the tide in a single, unforgettable confrontation. Before any bombs fell, before any dive bombers carved their deadly arcs toward the Japanese carriers, the war was being fought in quiet rooms filled with tables, charts, and the soft hum of concentration. In the bowels of Pearl Harbor, Station HYPO hummed with a nervous energy that few outside its walls could comprehend. Cryptographers hunched over fragments of intercepted Japanese messages, translating, comparing, and analyzing patterns that, if interpreted correctly, could change the course of the Pacific War. Joseph Rushford, the legendary leader of the team, moved among them like a conductor guiding a symphony. His eyes scanned codes and diagrams, searching for subtle irregularities, inconsistencies, and patterns hidden in the vast sea of JN-25, the complex, unciphered Japanese naval code. Every day, hours of meticulous labor brought them closer to a revelation that could overturn the Japanese advantage. The breakthrough came not with fanfare but with quiet clarity. A small message indicated the target F, ambiguous, yet familiar to Rushford and his team. By orchestrating a ruse involving fake water supply reports from Midway Island, they tricked the Japanese into confirming that AF indeed referred to Midway. The silent confirmation rippled through the room like a secret thunderclap. The team had unlocked the location of the trap before Japan even knew America knew. On the American carriers, the intelligence filtered through channels like an invisible tide. Commanders studied the decrypted reports with grim intensity. Nimitz, Spruance, and Fletcher realized that the Japanese were sailing not just into a battle but into a preordained ambush. Every calculation, flight deck spacing, approach angles, timing of torpedo and dive bomber runs, could now be informed by knowledge that the enemy considered unknowable. Meanwhile, Japanese officers moved under a false sense of confidence. Their fleet, meticulously prepared, moved in formations designed to dominate. The psychological certainty of victory permeated every decision. Deck crews prepared aircraft, pilots reviewed attack procedures, and admirals mapped out the destruction of what they assumed were the remaining American carriers. Yet this confidence, unchallenged and untested, was about to be shattered. The dual narratives, the invisible intelligence war on one side and the meticulous preparations on the other, created a tension that stretched across the Pacific. Every day of travel toward Midway brought both fleets closer to the collision point, each unaware of the exact hand the other held. For the Americans, confidence mixed with anxiety. They knew what the Japanese expected, yet they could not predict the chaos of battle itself, the human errors, the fog of war, and the unpredictability of chance. Yet every pilot, sailor, and officer carried the knowledge that they were positioned to strike with precision, that the scales had tilted in ways Japan would never foresee. On the Japanese carriers, psychology was a silent weapon and a silent weakness. Officers expected flawless execution, and sailors believed in inevitable victory. This psychological overconfidence, paired with a lack of awareness of American code-breaking capabilities, made the fleet brittle, vulnerable, and tragically blind to the storm waiting over Midway. In these quiet hours before battle, the war had already begun, not with guns, bombs, or explosions, but with knowledge, calculation, and the invisible threads of strategy that would turn the tide in a single, unforgettable confrontation. The vast Pacific stretched endlessly, its waves glittering beneath the rising sun. From the American perspective, carriers steamed with precision, formations tight, decks humming with readiness. Pilots climbed into their aircraft, engines already thrumming, the metal and oil of the Hellcats, dauntless, and devastators alive under their hands. Each man carried a mixture of focus and unspoken fear, a knowledge that today would mark history. Thousands of miles away, the Japanese carriers cut a symmetrical pattern through the water, for mighty decks poised for domination. Sailors went about drills with automatic precision, unaware that their every movement was being shadowed, measured, and anticipated. The officers projected confidence, yet even within the rigid discipline, subtle currents of tension coursed beneath the surface, minor misalignments in formation, hesitations in aircraft launch timing, small cracks that intelligence would later exploit. From above, the American pilots scanned the horizon, their senses stretched taut. The glide of the F-4F Wildcats, the hum of dauntless engines, the distant shimmer of enemy vessels created a tableau of calm before violence. Every observation, every mental note, became a potential advantage. The pilots knew their dive points, their attack angles, their release altitudes, a choreography rehearsed in both simulation and imagination. Below, the Japanese decks moved with deceptive rhythm. Torpedo bombers were prepared, flight crews coordinated, and the carriers themselves seemed unassailable. Yet the psychological weight of overconfidence hung invisibly over the fleet, a blindfold to the threat approaching from the skies. The officers believed in mastery, in inevitability. They did not anticipate the precision, patience, and resolve of the Americans closing silently across the waves. As the distance closed, the two forces were locked in a slow-motion tension. Aircraft formations maneuvered into position, glide paths calculated to perfection. The American dive bombers, some already in steep descent, became invisible harbingers of destruction. The Japanese decks, bathed in sunlight and seemingly serene, remained oblivious to the catastrophe about to unfold above them. Every crew member, every pilot, every officer existed in a suspended reality. Minutes stretched into eternity as the fleets approached the point of no return. The ocean, vast and indifferent, reflected the sky's calm, masking the violence to come. And yet, both sides felt the unspoken knowledge of impending confrontation, a prelude sensed in nerves, in tension, in the synchronized rhythm of engines and sea. Above all, the psychological battle had already begun. On the American side, the knowledge of code-breaking created a tense confidence, a quiet anticipation that what they were about to unleash could not be resisted. On the Japanese side, anticipation of easy victory reinforced their vulnerability, amplifying the shock that would soon engulf them. The carriers loomed closer, the dive points nearing, and the pilots began their final adjustments. In the air, in the water, and on the decks below, the calm was absolute, a deceptive, fragile stillness before the inexorable roar of battle erupted, shaping Midway into the decisive confrontation that would stun Japan and echo through history. Time slowed as the dive bombers began their final descent. The American aircraft streaked through the sky in perfect formation, engines screaming a metallic warning to the unsuspecting fleet below. The sun glinted off wings, cockpit glass, and the vast, empty ocean, casting reflections that danced like omens on the water's surface. From above, the carriers appeared deceptively calm. Sailors went about their duties, unaware that death and destruction were descending from the heavens. Every deck, every aircraft, every piece of rigging was about to be tested in seconds that would stretch into eternities in the memories of those who survived. Akagi's flight deck erupted first. A bomb tore through the hangar bay, igniting fuel, shattering aircraft, and throwing men into the air. Sailors scrambled, some frozen by shock, others moving with desperate instinct. Flames climbed the superstructure, black smoke curling into the sky, marking the moment when the invincibility of the Japanese fleet shattered. Kaga followed almost simultaneously. The dive bombers, released at precisely calculated altitudes and angles, struck with surgical precision. Explosions ripped through her deck, sending fire and twisted metal skyward. The roar of detonating bombs and exploding fuel mingled with the thunder of engines above, creating a sensory storm that overwhelmed every human sense below. On Soryu, similar destruction unfolded. Officers barked commands, pilots attempted to scramble, but chaos reigned. Explosions tore through hangars, throwing flaming debris across the deck, while men fought desperately to contain the fires. The psychological shock was instantaneous. The notion that their carriers could be obliterated in minutes, in such a systematic and unstoppable manner, crushed morale even before total destruction. Above, the American pilots adjusted their trajectories, pulling out of dives, banking, and circling for secondary strikes. Every release was precise, every movement calculated, yet the chaos below seemed almost surreal, a testament to the meticulous planning that had allowed such precision to meet overwhelming effect. The ocean shimmered with the reflections of fire and smoke, waves breaking against sinking steel like indifferent witnesses to the unfolding catastrophe. In the command rooms of the Japanese carriers, disbelief replaced command. Officers frozen at their stations struggled to process what was happening. Flags fluttered uselessly in the smoke-choked air. Radios crackled with panicked voices, and the sense of invincibility that had driven them across the Pacific dissolved in flames and steel. Thousands of soldiers, sailors, and airmen became casualties within minutes, their coordinated lives shattered by a combination of American audacity, intelligence, and exacting execution. The psychological impact rippled outward, shock, confusion, and horror spreading through the fleet like fire across dry timber. Hiryu remained intact temporarily, launching aircraft in attempts to strike back, but the sequence of destruction had set the pattern. The calm that had preceded the attack was replaced by a visceral understanding. Victory had switched sides, and Japan's mighty carriers were no longer the unassailable pillars of dominance they had believed. Every pilot, sailor, and officer on both sides experienced the collision of preparation and chaos, the immutable lesson of Midway. Even the strongest fortress can be brought low by knowledge, timing, and precise execution. In slow-motion horror and awe, the dive bombers had reshaped the Pacific in a matter of minutes, an apex of strategic genius and human courage that stunned Japan and echoed through history. Flames devoured the decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu with relentless speed. The heat was visible even from the sky, a flickering, consuming force that turned steel into molten ruin. Sailors, trapped between exploding ordnance and rising smoke, scrambled in panic, their footsteps lost amid the roar of engines and the thunder of detonations. On Akagi, fire raced from hangar to bridge, consuming communications equipment, radios, and navigational instruments. Officers shouted commands, but their words dissolved into the chaos, unanswered and unheard. The once pristine flight deck twisted, buckled, and groaned under the weight of flames and debris. Kaga's destruction mirrored Akagi's, yet each explosion carried its own brutal rhythm. Bombs ruptured fuel tanks, ignited bombs in storage, and sent aircraft tumbling into the sea. Sailors leapt overboard in desperate flight, their uniforms aflame, eyes wide with disbelief. The sheer scale of devastation created a psychological shock that rippled through the Japanese fleet like an invisible tidal wave. Soryu, struggling to recover from the initial strikes, became a baining specter. Flames raced along the deck, smoke spiraled upward, and the ship's superstructure groaned under internal pressure. Pilots on deck tried to launch aircraft, but timing and coordination had been destroyed. Men moved in terror, some frozen, some driven by pure instinct, yet the human effort could not match the speed of destruction raining from above. From above, American dive bombers circled, observing the calculated ruin below. Engines screamed, wings glimmered in sunlight, and the pilots processed the surreal tableau of destruction. Thousands of lives extinguished, hundreds of planes destroyed, and 3 of the Japanese carriers reduced to flaming hulks within minutes, all consequences of intelligence, precision, and audacity converging in one moment. The psychological effect on Japanese officers and sailors was profound. Shock replaced strategy, disbelief replaced discipline. Communications fractured, orders were delayed or ignored, and the sense of inevitability that had carried the fleet across the Pacific dissolved into chaos. Sailors glanced at each other, searching for reassurance, yet finding none, only fire, smoke, and the relentless sounds of dying machinery. Even as Hiryu attempted counterstrikes, launching aircraft to retaliate against the Americans, the sequence of destruction was irreversible. Smoke from the burning carriers obscured flight paths, confusion disrupted coordination, and every moment of attempted action collided with the overwhelming momentum of disaster. In the air above, the American pilots began regrouping, yet the scene below already told the story. A devastating combination of firepower, tactical precision, and psychological dominance had shattered Japan's offensive capability. The carriers, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, were now flames and sinking steel, their crews traumatized by the speed and completeness of their undoing. Midway had transformed from a strategic operation into a spectacle of shock and horror. The psychological weight of this catastrophe would reverberate through the Japanese command for days, weeks, and months to come. Even for those who survived, the realization was chilling. The war could no longer be predicted, controlled, or assumed victorious. The calm, confident fleet that had sailed so proudly now lay in ashes, an eternal testament to the sudden, crushing power of intelligence and precise execution. Hiryu alone remained, a shadow of Japan's once mighty carrier strike force. Smoke from Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu drifted across the water, a grim reminder that the tide of the battle had already turned. Officers on Hiryu's bridge moved with forced urgency, their calm veneer cracking as they issued orders to launch aircraft in retaliation. The psychological weight of failure pressed heavily on every man aboard, a tangible presence that twisted nerves and slowed reaction. Aircraft roared off Hiryu's deck, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and Zero fighters eager to reclaim honor. Yet their departure was fraught with risk. Smoke obscured visibility, American fighters patrolled the skies, and anti-aircraft fire from the U.S. carriers was already anticipating every vector. The coordination that had carried Japan across the Pacific dissolved under the pressure of unfolding disaster. In the air, the first American Hellcats and Wildcats intercepted the attackers with ruthless precision. The gliding omniscient I observed maneuvers that stretched both courage and desperation to their limits. Pilots twisted and rolled to evade fire, engines screaming, wings shimmering in the sun as bullets and tracer rounds carved paths through the sky. The dance of destruction was meticulous, calculated, and relentless, a testament to the Americans' mastery of timing and positioning. Below, Hiryu's deck crews attempted rapid reloads and launch sequences, but panic had seeped into every corner. Sailors miscounted ordnance, aircraft collided during takeoff, and officers struggled to maintain order against the mounting chaos. The fires from previous strikes threatened to spread further, smoke choking the decks, masking danger, and eroding morale. As the first wave of Hiryu-launched aircraft approached the American carriers, dive bombers began their descent. Calculated defensive maneuvers, coordinated anti-aircraft fire, and superior altitude advantage turned their attempts into near-suicidal engagements. One by one, torpedo bombers and dive bombers were intercepted, shot down in a violent ballet of fire and twisted metal, their pilots plunging into the Pacific with only moments to process the unfolding nightmare. The psychological toll on Hiryu's crew intensified with each passing minute. Fear became tangible, palpable, spreading like an invisible wildfire through every compartment, every flight deck, and every officer's station. Hope dwindled as American fighters circled above, relentless and untiring, their presence an inescapable testament to both preparation and superiority. Finally, the inevitable came. Dive bombers from the U.S. carriers found their release points, plunging toward Hiryu in synchronized precision. Bombs tore through flight decks, igniting fuel and aircraft in a conflagration that quickly consumed the ship. Officers attempted evacuation, sailors abandoned their stations, and the once proud carrier began to list, smoke rising in suffocating columns that obscured the sun. Within hours, Hiryu joined his sister ships, sinking into the Pacific and leaving thousands of Japanese personnel clinging to debris or struggling in the open water. The psychological collapse of the fleet was complete. The pride, confidence, and assumption of invincibility had been extinguished in a single, decisive day. The American pilots, now circling for reconnaissance and rescue operations, observed the aftermath. Engines still whining, wings glinting in the sun, they watched as the final remnants of Japan's carrier force succumbed. The strategic victory was total. The psychological shock to Japan would echo far beyond the immediate losses, altering planning, morale, and perception of the Pacific War for months to come. Midway had become more than a battle. It was a demonstration of the power of foresight, intelligence, and precision. It was the moment when the tide shifted irrevocably, when Japan's assumption of superiority was shattered, and America's resolve crystallized in both fire and consequence. The ocean, vast and indifferent, bore witness to the remnants of the once mighty Japanese carrier force. Sailors clung to floating debris, their bodies battered by explosions and shrapnel, eyes wide with disbelief. The calm determination of hours before had been replaced by raw survival instinct, grasping, treading, waiting for rescue that was uncertain and slow. Above, American pilots circled, engines whining, scanning the water for survivors while absorbing the enormity of their accomplishment. The scale of destruction was staggering. Thousands of Japanese soldiers lost in a matter of hours, carriers reduced to flaming wrecks, and a psychological blow that would reverberate through the Imperial Navy. Yet the Americans felt a complex mixture of triumph and gravity. Every victory was measured in human cost. On the decks of the remaining U.S. carriers, sailors and officers moved methodically. Damage control, reconnaissance, and tending to the wounded took precedence over celebration. The victory at Midway was total, yet the awareness of what had been lost, the weight of responsibility, and the knowledge that the war was far from over tempered every movement. In Japanese command centers, the psychological shock was profound. Admiral Yamamoto and his staff processed reports with disbelief. Orders had gone unexecuted, carriers had been destroyed in minutes, and the illusion of invincibility had evaporated. Officers questioned decisions, communications had broken down, and the survivors bore the weight of witnessing the near-total annihilation of a fleet they had believed unstoppable. The impact was immediate and strategic. Japan's naval doctrine, confidence in carrier supremacy, and assumptions about American capabilities were all called into question. Fear replaced pride, caution replaced aggression, and the psychological recalibration rippled through the ranks. For many sailors and pilots, the realization of mortality and vulnerability would linger far longer than the immediate battle. For the Americans, the psychological victory was double-edged. Pilots, officers, and crews understood that precision, intelligence, and timing had carried them to a historic triumph. Yet the visceral reality of the carnage, the drowned sailors, the burning steel, the screaming flight decks, reminded them that victory was inseparable from human cost. As sun dipped toward the horizon, the Pacific appeared deceptively serene. Waves lapped against floating debris, smoke rose in slow columns, and the silhouettes of the shattered carriers marked a permanent scar on the ocean's surface. Yet the air remained tense, silent but heavy with the memory of destruction, both seen and unseen. Midway had become a psychological pivot point in the Pacific War. Japan had been stunned, its pride shattered, its fleet diminished, and its confidence in carrier supremacy broken. America had seized not just a tactical victory but a profound psychological edge, demonstrating that meticulous planning, intelligence, and resolve could redefine the course of a conflict that spanned thousands of miles of ocean and countless human lives. For both sides, the battle's aftermath was more than physical. It reshaped minds, recalibrated strategy, and left a legacy of shock and respect for the unseen hand of preparation that had determined the fate of thousands in a single, decisive day. In the aftermath of Midway, Japan's high command faced a grim reality. The destruction of 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, was more than a tactical setback. It represented a collapse of the strategic assumptions that had guided months of aggressive planning. Officers gathered in dimly lit rooms aboard surviving ships and in distant command centers, poring over maps and reports, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and dawning fear. Admiral Yamamoto, once confident in the inevitability of victory, confronted the immensity of the loss. The fleet's operational capability had been drastically reduced, and with it, the ability to project naval air power across the Pacific. Morale among surviving officers and sailors was fractured, tempered by the realization that the Americans had struck with precision, foresight, and intelligence that had outmatched even Japan's most meticulous preparations. The psychological implications were immediate and profound. Commanders questioned their planning, the reliability of their reconnaissance, and the assumed invincibility of the carrier fleet. Pride had been replaced by hesitation, and confidence now bore the weight of uncertainty. Every decision henceforth would be measured against the memory of the Midway catastrophe, a vivid testament to the fragility of dominance when overconfidence met meticulous intelligence and preparation. The loss forced Japan to reconsider its offensive strategy. With its carrier strength decimated, aggressive expansion in the Pacific had to be tempered. Operational plans that had counted on absolute air superiority now required recalibration, and the Imperial Navy faced the grim prospect of fighting a defensive war under conditions of constrained resources and diminished morale. Survivors of the sunken carriers returned to port with eyes wide from shock, recounting the surreal destruction and the near-impossible speed at which their pride and fleet had been erased. Their stories, shared among officers and sailors, contributed to a broader psychological collapse. Confidence was replaced by caution. Boldness gave way to anxiety. Each subsequent operation would be haunted by the specter of Midway, by the knowledge that a single, precisely executed strike could obliterate even the most formidable formations. On the American side, the strategic implications were equally weighty, though framed through the lens of cautious optimism. Victory at Midway had shifted the balance of power in the Pacific, but commanders understood that the war was far from over. The success reinforced the value of intelligence, coordination, and preparation, the invisible forces that had achieved what sheer firepower alone could not. The Americans had gained more than a tactical win. They had seized a psychological edge that would guide their next moves across the Pacific theater. As naval planners on both sides adjusted to the new reality, the psychological and strategic impact of Midway became increasingly clear. Japan had been stunned not just by destruction, but by the demonstration of foresight and precision. America had proven that even against a proud and powerful navy, intelligence and preparation could deliver decisive results. In the months following, every maneuver, every deployment, and every engagement would bear the imprint of Midway's lessons. The psychological shock endured by Japanese officers influenced doctrine, risk assessment, and planning, while American forces pressed the advantage, confident in the demonstrated power of meticulous preparation. Midway was more than a battle. It was a turning point in the Pacific War, a moment when the combination of intelligence, courage, and precise execution reshaped the strategic and psychological landscape of a conflict that would continue across thousands of miles of ocean and countless lives. The waves of Midway's devastation extended far beyond the immediate sinking of carriers and loss of life. In Japan, the news traveled slowly at first, carried by desperate signals, fragmented reports, and the grim faces of returning survivors. For officers and sailors alike, morale collapsed under the weight of an unprecedented defeat. Confidence in previously infallible tactics was replaced by suspicion, hesitation, and a pervasive fear of repetition. The psychological aftershocks rippled into every level of command. Younger pilots questioned their instructors, mid-level officers doubted their judgments, admirals weighed every decision against the shadow of failure. The once bold, aggressive culture that had fueled the Imperial Navy's expansion became brittle, restrained by the memory of sudden annihilation. Every sortie, every maneuver, every calculated risk would be haunted by the memory of 4 carriers disappearing in hours. Meanwhile, American forces absorbed a different kind of psychological impact. Across carrier decks, among the pilots and crew, the victory imbued a quiet, tempered confidence. Yet this confidence was not arrogance. It was awareness, sharpened by the knowledge that precision, intelligence, and teamwork had yielded a historic triumph. The men understood the stakes. Each subsequent battle would demand equal calculation and courage. The ripple effects were operational as well as psychological. Japan's ability to project power in the Pacific was now significantly impaired. Strategic planning shifted from aggressive expansion to cautious consolidation, while the Americans gained both the momentum and the blueprint to continue offensive operations. The battle had demonstrated that numerical strength alone was insufficient. Intelligence and timing could redefine outcomes before engagement even began. Across both fleets, the slow recalibration was palpable. Japanese officers, haunted by the loss and the unpredictability of American strategy, revised doctrines, increased caution, and doubted assumptions they had long held sacred. American planners, conversely, refined tactics, studied the psychological reactions of their enemy, and prepared to exploit the vulnerabilities revealed at Midway. The long-term psychological consequences were perhaps the most profound. Survivors of the Japanese carriers carried trauma into future operations, their fear tempered by necessity but never forgotten. Pilots and sailors internalized the lesson that any error, miscalculation, or overlooked detail could become fatal. For the Americans, the triumph reinforced the doctrine that preparation and intelligence were as deadly as guns and bombs, a guiding principle for the remainder of the Pacific campaign. Midway had thus extended far beyond a single day of combat. It had become a reference point, a psychological and strategic watershed. It redefined confidence, reshaped operational norms, and created an enduring awareness of the thin line between assured victory and catastrophic loss. In the endless expanse of the Pacific, the echoes of that day persisted, informing every subsequent maneuver, every tactical decision, and every human heartbeat aboard carrier decks on both sides of the conflict. In the weeks following Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy grappled with an unprecedented psychological crisis. The sudden loss of 4 carriers, each a symbol of naval pride and technological supremacy, forced officers and strategists to confront the fragility of their dominance. Fleet meetings were tense, filled with unspoken fear beneath the veneer of protocol. Every proposal, every order, carried the weight of prior catastrophe. Admiral Yamamoto, once supremely confident in the capabilities of his fleet, now faced the sobering necessity of recalibration. Strategic offensives, previously predicated on aggressive superiority, were re-evaluated under the lens of vulnerability. The Japanese command realized that intelligence failures, overconfidence, and the precise execution of American plans had combined to devastate their naval power. For surviving pilots and sailors, the psychological impact was equally severe. Many returned to base haunted by images of burning decks, drowning comrades, and the deafening silence that followed explosions. Training routines became exercises not only in skill but in psychological resilience. Instructors emphasized discipline under chaos, the ability to make rapid decisions when the unexpected struck, and the mental endurance required to survive an unpredictable enemy. Fleet tactics underwent significant revision. Formations that had once assumed absolute air superiority were now adjusted to account for intelligence leaks, reconnaissance failures, and the superior coordination of American forces. Carriers were dispersed more cautiously, air cover strategies were revised, and contingency planning became a constant, living requirement rather than a theoretical exercise. On a psychological level, officers became more hesitant, analyzing every potential risk, sometimes to the point of paralysis. Confidence was measured, almost cautious, as the haunting memory of Midway lingered over every operation. Meanwhile, the lower ranks absorbed stories of the destruction, internalizing fear alongside duty. Courage was required not only in battle but in confronting the mental specter of past disaster. Yet, even in defeat, a slow recovery began. Training intensified, new pilots were readied, and morale-building measures were implemented to restore confidence. The Japanese leadership recognized that rebuilding operational capability would take time, patience, and careful management of the fleet's collective psychology. Across the Pacific, the Americans noted these adjustments with awareness. Intelligence continued to inform every operation, exploiting Japan's measured caution while reinforcing the psychological edge gained at Midway. The war had entered a new phase, one in which the human mind, morale, and mental resilience were as critical as ships, aircraft, and firepower. Midway's shadow was long, extending beyond the immediate tactical victory. It forced Japan to confront not just physical losses but the collapse of assumed psychological supremacy. For the Americans, it reinforced the doctrine that insight, preparation, and calculated precision could redefine outcomes, reshaping the theater of war in both strategy and perception. The success at Midway reverberated through the decks of the American fleet like a wave of quiet but resolute confidence. Sailors moved with a newfound assurance, pilots stepped into their aircraft with an intensified focus, and commanders meticulously reviewed the lessons of the battle. Unlike Japan, the Americans did not allow victory to breed complacency. Instead, it became a psychological foundation upon which future operations would be constructed. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher understood the intangible power that had been gained. Intelligence had guided precision, courage had executed the plan, and the psychological victory, the knowledge that Japan's carrier supremacy had been broken, was as decisive as any physical loss. The realization infused the fleet with discipline and determination, a quiet momentum that would carry through the subsequent months of the Pacific campaign. Across American carriers, pilots trained relentlessly, simulating dive-bombing runs, torpedo approaches, and fighter coordination. But beyond the technical preparation, an unspoken mental conditioning took hold, a sense that with preparation, skill, and intelligence, they could challenge any force the Japanese could muster. This psychological edge, forged at Midway, became the invisible weapon in the ongoing war. Even the ground crews absorbed the victory, understanding that their meticulous maintenance and readiness had enabled the pilots to strike decisively. Each screw tightened, each fuel line checked, each aircraft properly armed was part of a larger mental framework, a collective confidence that their efforts directly influenced outcomes on the battlefield. The ripple effect extended beyond the immediate participants. Messages of success circulated up and down the chain of command, reinforcing doctrine, morale, and belief in the effectiveness of American intelligence operations. Hypo's cryptographers were lauded not just for their analytical prowess, but for the profound psychological leverage they had delivered. Knowledge, once invisible, had become a decisive instrument of war. Meanwhile, forward planning began in earnest. Fleet commanders reviewed the broader Pacific map, considering Japan's remaining capabilities, adjusting movements, and anticipating the psychological state of their adversaries. Each operation was now informed by the twin lessons of tactical precision and the mental impact of previous victories. American confidence was tempered by respect for the enemy, but the momentum was unmistakable. In both mind and action, the fleet understood that Midway had shifted the balance of power. The Japanese carriers had been sunk, their morale shattered, and the once unstoppable Imperial Navy was now forced into cautious recalibration. As the fleet sailed forward into the vast expanse of the Pacific, each sailor, pilot, and officer carried the intangible weapon of belief, the knowledge that preparation, intelligence, and courage could not only defeat an enemy but fundamentally reshape the psychological landscape of war. Midway was not merely a battle won. It was a lesson etched into the consciousness of both sides, guiding every subsequent maneuver, every calculation, and every heartbeat across the endless ocean. The Battle of Midway did more than sink 4 Japanese carriers. It fundamentally reshaped the strategic and psychological landscape of the Pacific War. Japan, once confident in its supremacy, faced a reality of vulnerability and recalibration. Its remaining carriers and surface fleet had been proven mortal, and the psychological ripple of this loss would influence every decision in the months and years to come. In Tokyo, high command meetings were somber. Strategy sessions that once radiated certainty were now dominated by debate and second-guessing. The loss of skilled pilots, crew, and the carriers themselves forced Japan to shift from bold offensives to measured, defensive maneuvers. Every decision carried the lingering shadow of Midway, the reminder that overconfidence could be lethal and intelligence could tip the scales before a single shot was fired. Across the Pacific, the Americans seized a newfound advantage with both caution and resolve. Carrier task forces projected a growing confidence, yet there was no room for arrogance. Training intensified, intelligence networks expanded, and pilots were instilled with the dual understanding that the enemy was both capable and fallible. Every sortie was now informed by the psychological and operational lessons of Midway. Speed, precision, timing, and morale would decide outcomes before engagement escalated to chaos. The psychological impact extended into both fleets' operational planning. Japanese commanders now prioritized reconnaissance and defensive posturing, attempting to avoid unexpected ambushes. The caution bred by Midway reshaped fleet movements and the deployment of air power across contested zones. Meanwhile, American planners exploited this new defensive mindset, anticipating Japanese hesitations and preparing to strike with carefully calculated aggression. On the human level, the battle had a lingering effect. Survivors of Midway, both Japanese and American, carried experiences that would influence morale and decision-making in subsequent operations. For the Japanese, fear and caution intertwined with the relentless pressure to rebuild. Pilots and sailors processed trauma while attempting to maintain discipline, understanding that the mental state of a crew could influence the outcome of every engagement. American forces, conversely, absorbed confidence without hubris. Lessons from Midway reinforced the doctrine of preparation, intelligence, and precision. Psychological momentum became a strategic tool, ensuring that each subsequent operation leveraged not only material advantage but also the collective confidence and coordination of crews at every level. The Pacific theater was no longer defined merely by numbers of ships or planes. It was a psychological chessboard, where knowledge, preparation, and perception could shape battles before the first bomb fell. Midway had proved that intelligence, courage, and precise execution could overturn assumptions, break morale, and redefine strategic possibilities. As both fleets adjusted to this new reality, the stage was set for a war that would continue to test endurance, skill, and the fragile equilibrium of human psychology. The Pacific was alive with tension, every island, carrier, and aircraft a node in a network of strategic and psychological influence. Midway had not just ended a battle, it had begun a new chapter in which the mind, as much as the fleet, would determine the outcome of war. Amidst the tactical victories and strategic shifts, The human cost of Midway loomed large. For the Japanese, the sudden obliteration of 4 carriers and the thousands of sailors and pilots aboard them created a psychological trauma that would haunt survivors and ripple through the Navy for months. Each man who escaped the burning decks carried vivid memories: the screams of comrades, the crackle of fuel-fed fires, and the endless horizon of the Pacific, indifferent to their suffering. Sailors who floated in debris-laden waters recounted moments frozen in time: the deafening explosions, the sudden plunges of their ships, the desperate dives to avoid fire and shrapnel, all etched into memory with the permanence of horror. Officers and commanders faced the additional burden of guilt. Decisions that had led to death, even when made under extreme uncertainty, weighed heavily on their conscience. For many, morale fractured under the weight of helplessness and disbelief. American personnel, while victorious, were not spared the human toll. Pilots who had executed precise dive-bombing runs carried the heavy knowledge that their actions had directly ended thousands of lives. Crew members on carriers watched comrades fall and aircraft engulfed in flames, their adrenaline slowly giving way to exhaustion and reflection. The psychological aftermath manifested in quiet tension, sleepless nights, and a deepened awareness of mortality. Medical teams on both sides confronted waves of injury, burns, broken bones, and trauma. The sounds of battle, explosions, fire, cries, remained imprinted even after the smoke cleared. For the Japanese, the survivors' psychological state compounded operational challenges. Training, focus, and confidence required for subsequent missions were now undermined by lingering fear and trauma. In the broader context of the war, Midway became a case study in the intersection of strategy and human resilience. The Americans learned that victory demanded not just precision and intelligence, but also attention to the emotional and mental state of personnel. Maintaining morale, providing psychological support, and sustaining discipline under extreme pressure became operational imperatives. Across the Pacific, the human cost of Midway reshaped both sides' perceptions of risk, leadership, and endurance. For Japan, the realization that no amount of pride or technological prowess could shield crews from sudden catastrophe brought a sober reassessment of tactics and doctrine. For the Americans, the victory was a lesson in the power of preparation and precision, tempered by an understanding of the fragility of life in combat. Midway was more than a clash of steel and fire. It was a crucible of human endurance, courage, and psychological resilience. The scars it left, visible and invisible, would shape the remainder of the Pacific conflict, influencing decisions, strategies, and the mental fortitude of sailors and pilots on both sides of the ocean. The Battle of Midway became an enduring lesson in the integration of intelligence, strategy, and human psychology. Across the Pacific, naval commanders on both sides analyzed the engagement in painstaking detail, seeking to extract every possible insight from the rapid destruction of Japan's carrier force. For the Japanese, the lessons were both technical and deeply psychological. The overconfidence in carrier supremacy had been catastrophic. Reliance on rigid formations and predictable attack patterns had been exploited by intelligence that they failed to anticipate. Fleet doctrine was reevaluated to emphasize flexibility, reconnaissance, and the importance of anticipating enemy intelligence capabilities. Pilots were retrained to consider evasive maneuvers, dispersal tactics, and redundancy in planning, a painful but necessary adaptation to a stark new reality. Psychologically, the Japanese Navy learned that morale, discipline, and confidence were as vulnerable as the steel of their carriers. The trauma inflicted on survivors underscored that human factors could dictate the outcome as much as mechanical or tactical elements. The shadow of Midway would influence decision-making, risk assessment, and the willingness to engage in bold operations for months to come. For the Americans, Midway validated the profound impact of intelligence-driven warfare. Code-breaking, reconnaissance, and meticulous planning had allowed a smaller force to overcome a numerically superior enemy. Beyond tactics, the psychological effect on American personnel was enormous. Confidence was bolstered, not merely in victory but in the operational principle that preparation, insight, and disciplined execution could decisively shape outcomes. American naval doctrine evolved accordingly. Carrier task forces were increasingly designed for flexibility and rapid response, with emphasis on combined intelligence, air superiority, and coordinated strikes. Pilots were trained to execute precise, synchronized attacks under complex and chaotic conditions, understanding that each decision in the air could have strategic consequences far beyond the immediate engagement. Midway also underscored the importance of psychological warfare. The shock to Japanese morale demonstrated that the perception of invincibility could be shattered quickly and irreversibly. Conversely, the Americans recognized the value of maintaining morale, cohesion, and mental readiness under pressure, knowing that confidence could amplify operational effectiveness in ways that physical firepower alone could not achieve. Across the Pacific theater, the lessons of Midway resonated. Strategic calculations were forever altered, operational doctrines revised, and the balance of psychological power shifted. Ships, aircraft, and weaponry were crucial, but Midway revealed that the human mind, its discipline, anticipation, and resilience, was as decisive as any gun, torpedo, or dive bomber. The battle had set a precedent. Intelligence and mental acuity could dictate the tempo of war. Precise execution could outweigh numerical superiority, and the lessons of a single day could echo across the theater of conflict, reshaping doctrine and strategy for months and years. Midway had not only won a battle, it had redefined the very nature of naval warfare in the Pacific. Weeks turned into months, and the psychological aftermath of Midway continued to reverberate across the Pacific. On the Japanese side, the loss of 4 carriers and thousands of trained personnel left deep scars on morale. Officers who had survived the battle carried the burden of responsibility, haunted by the knowledge that their decisions, or lack thereof, had contributed to the catastrophic loss. Survivors at sea and on distant bases grappled with trauma, fear, and a growing sense of vulnerability. For the Japanese Navy, every subsequent operation was shadowed by caution. Aggressive maneuvers were tempered with hesitation. Pilots approached combat with a heightened awareness of mortality. Even the act of launching carriers into contested waters became fraught with stress and anxiety. The previously unshakable belief in their naval supremacy was replaced by a sober acknowledgement that mistakes could be fatal and that the Americans were capable of orchestrating precision strikes that could upend carefully laid plans. American forces experienced a contrasting psychological effect. Confidence surged, but it was disciplined confidence, rooted in proof that preparation and intelligence could decisively shift the course of engagements. Pilots approached missions with renewed focus. Crews executed operations with heightened efficiency, and the fleet as a whole operated with an increased sense of purpose. The victory at Midway had proven that courage, coordination, and knowledge could overcome numerical disadvantage, a realization that bolstered morale across the Pacific theater. The long-term mental consequences also influenced operational strategy. Japanese commanders overcorrected in some instances, adopting overly cautious postures, dispersing their forces, and delaying offensive initiatives. Conversely, American leaders capitalized on the psychological edge, pushing momentum forward with calculated offensives designed not only to achieve tactical objectives, but also to reinforce confidence and assert psychological dominance. Midway's lessons extended into training and leadership development. For Japan, understanding the human mind's role in warfare, fear, hesitation, trauma, became crucial in planning and preparation. For the Americans, fostering discipline, focus, and mental resilience in the face of overwhelming odds became as important as gunnery, navigation, and aviation skill. As months progressed, the Pacific became a theater where psychological factors were inseparable from tactical and strategic considerations. Both fleets learned that morale, perception of strength, and mental readiness could determine the outcome of engagements even before the first shot was fired. Midway had not only reshaped the physical balance of power but had shifted the mental equilibrium of war, leaving indelible marks on both Japanese and American forces. The echoes of Midway persisted in every mission, every planning session, and every encounter. Fear and caution haunted Japanese pilots. Confidence and precision drove American operations. Across the vast, open waters of the Pacific, the psychological battlefield had become as decisive as any physical clash, a testament to the enduring legacy of one day that had changed the course of naval warfare forever. The aftermath of Midway forced both the Japanese and American commands to rethink their entire approach to the Pacific War. For Japan, the sudden and devastating loss of 4 carriers meant that aggressive expansion was no longer a sustainable strategy. Fleet deployments shifted from bold offensives to cautious patrols, reconnaissance became paramount, and every engagement carried the weight of potential catastrophe. The psychological impact of Midway had translated directly into operational behavior. Hesitation now tempered action, and the confidence that had once driven rapid conquest had been replaced by anxiety and meticulous calculation. Japanese naval planners worked tirelessly to compensate for lost carriers, attempting to reorganize remaining forces and rebuild air strength. Training programs were intensified, not only to replace lost pilots, but also to instill a heightened awareness of the dangers posed by American intelligence and tactical precision. Morale building became a strategic priority, as leadership sought to counteract the lingering trauma and fear among surviving personnel. For the Americans, Midway offered an opportunity to seize the initiative. The Pacific Theater, once defined by Japanese offensive dominance, now presented openings for strategic and psychological leverage. Carrier task forces were deployed with an emphasis on flexibility, surprise, and coordinated strikes. Intelligence, reconnaissance, and code-breaking capabilities were strengthened, allowing the U.S. Navy to anticipate Japanese movements with unprecedented accuracy. Operational tactics evolved to incorporate both physical and psychological considerations. American planners recognized that demonstrating capability, precision, and resolve could undermine enemy morale even before engagement. Fleet movements, aircraft launches, and reconnaissance patrols were calculated not just for tactical effectiveness but also for the message they sent, a message that the Japanese Navy was no longer invincible. In the months following Midway, the shift in strategy became evident across multiple theaters of operation. Island defenses were reinforced, carrier task forces positioned for both offense and rapid response, and supply lines secured to support extended campaigns. For the Japanese, every operation became a delicate balance of caution and necessity, while the Americans increasingly acted with the confidence born from Midway's lessons in preparation, intelligence, and precise execution. The psychological dimension remained central. Japanese commanders, haunted by the rapid destruction at Midway, approached each engagement with heightened tension and scrutiny. American forces, buoyed by their success, carried a psychological momentum that enhanced discipline, coordination, and combat readiness. In this new phase of the war, the interplay of mental fortitude and operational capability proved as decisive as any engagement of steel and fire. Midway had shifted the Pacific War from a contest of raw strength to a battle in which strategy, intelligence, and psychological dominance dictated the tempo. Both sides now operated within this transformed framework, acutely aware that victory depended not only on the weapons they wielded but also on the minds, morale, and resilience of the men who wielded them. The Battle of Midway had demonstrated that aircraft carriers, once considered auxiliary to battleships, had become the central axis of naval power. For both the Japanese and American navies, the destruction of carriers and the decisive role of airstrikes underscored a fundamental shift in maritime warfare. The Pacific was no longer dominated by gunfire alone. Control of the skies above the fleet now dictated victory or defeat. For the Japanese, the loss was a harsh lesson in the vulnerabilities inherent to carrier operations. Traditional doctrines emphasizing concentrated formations and predictable strike patterns were now obsolete. Japanese planners began to explore dispersal tactics, improved reconnaissance, and rapid rearming procedures, but psychological hesitation often slowed adoption. Pilots, trained for aggressive offense, now had to balance aggression with survival instinct, a delicate mental calculus informed by Midway's catastrophic precedent. The Americans, on the other hand, capitalized on the lessons with remarkable agility. Carrier task forces were reorganized to maximize flexibility and coordination. Aircraft were grouped for both offensive and defensive synergy. Pilots trained rigorously in synchronized dive bombing, torpedo runs, and fighter escort maneuvers. Intelligence briefings emphasized not just the locations of enemy fleets but also their probable responses, creating a mental map of psychological and operational patterns to be exploited. Technological innovation also accelerated. Communications between carriers and aircraft became more sophisticated, allowing for rapid transmission of reconnaissance and strike data. Flight decks were optimized for faster launches and recoveries, fueling an operational tempo that could outpace Japanese expectations. Every advancement, whether mechanical or procedural, reinforced the American advantage, a combination of skill, technology, and psychological momentum. The human element remained central. American pilots internalized the lessons of Midway. Surprise, timing, and coordinated execution could overcome numerical disadvantage. Training emphasized mental resilience as much as technical proficiency, instilling confidence that precision and foresight could dictate the outcome of engagements even under the stress of combat. For Japan, The psychological scars of Midway continued to affect carrier aviation. Pilots approached missions with heightened caution, often overcompensating in ways that reduced operational effectiveness. Commanders, acutely aware of previous errors, demanded meticulous adherence to procedures, sometimes at the cost of initiative. The tension between caution and necessity became a defining feature of Japanese naval aviation in the months following the battle. The evolution of aircraft carrier warfare reshaped the Pacific theater. Midway had proven that carriers were not merely auxiliary ships but decisive instruments of power, capable of projecting influence far beyond their decks. The balance of naval power now depended on air superiority, coordination, and the mental readiness of personnel. In this new era, the interplay of technology, tactics, and human psychology determined the fate of fleets, islands, and lives across thousands of miles of ocean. The aftermath of Midway revealed a new truth. Control of the air was no longer a tactical advantage, it was a psychological weapon. Pilots, observers, and sailors alike came to understand that air superiority dictated not only the outcome of battles but the morale, confidence, and decision-making of both sides. The knowledge that enemy aircraft could strike with precision at any moment instilled a constant tension, shaping behavior long before engagement. For Japanese forces, the psychological impact was profound. Survivors of Midway carried the vivid memory of carriers engulfed in flames, their groups decimated within minutes. The fear of unseen American aircraft became a shadow over every operation. Even when numerical forces were adequate, the mental pressure of anticipating strikes and evasive maneuvers slowed response times, reduced cohesion, and heightened stress. Pilots flew missions burdened by the weight of previous loss, cautious to the point that initiative sometimes suffered. American pilots experienced the inverse effect. Confidence, born from successful execution at Midway, amplified their operational effectiveness. Crews understood that precision, timing, and coordination could decisively overwhelm an enemy. This psychological advantage translated into audacity in maneuvering, boldness in attacks, and a willingness to exploit every opening, knowing that the enemy's morale was fragile. The strategic implications were clear. Fleet commanders realized that the perception of control could influence enemy behavior as much as actual firepower. Aircraft in the skies served as both weapons and symbols, a visible threat that compelled caution, hesitation, or even panic among Japanese forces. Control of the air became a force multiplier, where psychological dominance reinforced operational capability. Training emphasized this dual role. American pilots learned to project aggression and confidence while maintaining disciplined formations, understanding that fear in the enemy could be as decisive as bombs or torpedoes. Simultaneously, Japanese training programs attempted to rebuild confidence, but the trauma of Midway made it difficult to instill the same level of assuredness, especially under the pressure of real combat. The psychological weight of air superiority extended beyond the immediate battlefields. Every reconnaissance flight, every patrol, and every strike carried both tactical and mental significance. Japanese fleets hesitated to commit fully, knowing that an unseen American aircraft could appear at the worst possible moment. American forces, conversely, leveraged this tension, integrating mental pressure into operational planning to shape outcomes before weapons were even deployed. By combining mastery of the skies with precise intelligence, the Americans had created a system in which psychological dominance reinforced strategic initiative. Midway had shown that confidence, preparation, and aerial control could disrupt enemy cohesion, break morale, and tilt engagements decisively. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, the human mind had become a battlefield as critical as any carrier deck, and the skies above a weapon of influence as powerful as the bombs they carried. The Battle of Midway was not the end of the Pacific War, but rather a decisive turning point that reshaped the conflict for years to come. The psychological and operational impact of the battle reverberated through every campaign, influencing decisions, tempo, and morale on both sides. For Japan, the months following Midway were defined by recovery and recalibration. With 4 carriers lost and thousands of experienced pilots gone, the Imperial Navy faced both material and mental deficits. Strategic initiatives had to be measured. Aggressive offensives were replaced with calculated operations designed to conserve resources and minimize further catastrophic losses. Survivors of Midway carried trauma and hesitation into every mission, their confidence undermined by the sudden, brutal lessons of the battle. This sustained psychological pressure forced Japanese planners to rethink tactics. Carrier formations became more dispersed, reconnaissance was emphasized, and operational decisions were weighed against the potential for surprise attacks by an increasingly confident American Navy. Morale building became a critical priority, with officers attempting to restore trust in leadership, equipment, and strategy, even as the shadow of Midway lingered over every decision. On the American side, the victory at Midway provided both operational momentum and psychological leverage. Commanders recognized that the enemy's hesitation could be exploited, allowing for more aggressive deployments of carriers, aircraft, and amphibious forces. Fleet movements became increasingly coordinated, leveraging both intelligence and confidence in execution. American pilots and crews carried with them the understanding that preparation and precision could overcome the enemy's numerical or technological advantages, a lesson that reinforced both morale and effectiveness. Operational tempo shifted as a result. The Americans, emboldened by Midway, initiated campaigns in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and beyond, while maintaining careful attention to intelligence and reconnaissance. Japan, on the defensive, struggled to regain initiative, constrained by the psychological scars of sudden losses and the need to protect what remained of its fleet. The battle had created a sustained imbalance, not just in physical assets but in mental readiness and strategic initiative. The human factor remained central. Japanese pilots and sailors faced constant reminders of vulnerability, while American personnel drew strength from confidence and validated doctrine. Training, preparation, and mental conditioning became as critical as gunnery or navigation. The Pacific, a vast and unforgiving theater, had transformed into a domain where psychological resilience, anticipation, and strategic foresight could determine the outcome of engagements long before the first shot was fired. In retrospect, Midway's legacy extended far beyond a single battle. It demonstrated that intelligence, coordination, and psychological advantage could redefine the course of a war. Japan would struggle under the long-term effects of loss and trauma, while America leveraged confidence and preparation to project power across the Pacific. The battle had shifted the war from a contest of attrition and numbers to a struggle of minds, morale, and calculated precision, setting the stage for the months and years of conflict that followed. After Midway, the Pacific became as much a theater of psychological warfare as of physical combat. The battle had shown that the human mind, confidence, fear, hesitation, and morale could dictate outcomes as much as bombs, torpedoes, and steel. Both Japanese and American forces now waged a war that extended far beyond conventional tactics into the very perceptions and expectations of their adversaries. For Japan, the lingering shock of Midway influenced every operation. Commanders became wary, sometimes overly cautious, weighing every movement against the possibility of American foreknowledge. Pilots, haunted by memories of the rapid destruction of their comrades and carriers, flew missions under the oppressive weight of fear. Even routine reconnaissance carried the psychological tension of anticipating unseen attacks. The once bold culture of Japanese naval aviation had become restrained, tempered by the mental scars of sudden vulnerability. The Americans, conversely, leveraged their psychological advantage. Confidence, honed through Midway's lessons, became a force multiplier. Pilots approached missions with both skill and mental composure, understanding that assertiveness in the skies could unnerve opponents before a single weapon was deployed. Fleet commanders recognized that demonstration of readiness and decisiveness could sap enemy morale, making Japanese caution itself a strategic asset for the U.S. Navy. Intelligence and deception played an amplified role. American codebreakers, reconnaissance flights, and feints were not merely tactical measures, they were psychological instruments designed to amplify the enemy's sense of vulnerability. Japanese leadership, aware that operational security had been breached before, approached every signal, every reconnaissance report, and every enemy movement with heightened anxiety. Morale became a strategic weapon. American crews were motivated by their success at Midway, but training and discipline ensured that confidence did not devolve into recklessness. Japanese crews, meanwhile, struggled to maintain faith in leadership and strategy, acutely aware of how quickly the tides of battle could turn. Midway had proven that perception and psychology could be decisive long before ships engaged or planes launched. Across the vast Pacific, this mental struggle influenced planning, deployment, and engagement. Islands became outposts not just of defense or attack, but of psychological presence. Carrier groups moved not only to strike but to project confidence, instilling fear or caution in enemy observers. Every maneuver, every sortie, carried the dual purpose of physical impact and mental pressure. Midway had shifted the war's paradigm. Victory was no longer measured solely by destruction inflicted, but by the ability to shape the enemy's perception and morale. The Pacific, endless and unforgiving, was now a theater where minds battled alongside machines, and where the shadow of a single day's destruction could dictate the tempo and tone of campaigns that would stretch across years. The catastrophic loss at Midway forced the Japanese Navy to confront an uncomfortable reality. Their pre-war doctrines, predicated on aggressive expansion and carrier supremacy, were no longer viable. The destruction of 4 carriers, coupled with the loss of experienced pilots, created a strategic vacuum that Japan struggled to fill. Japanese planners began to rethink fleet doctrine, emphasizing dispersal, lead defense, and heightened reconnaissance. Concentrated formations, once the hallmark of Japanese carrier strategy, were now considered dangerously predictable. Officers debated the balance between caution and offensive capability, often paralyzed by the knowledge that even minor miscalculations could produce disaster. Training regimens were overhauled to compensate for the loss of skilled aviators. New pilots faced accelerated programs designed to instill not only technical proficiency but also psychological resilience. Surviving veterans were pressed into mentorship roles, passing along the hard-earned lessons of Midway. Yet, despite these measures, the mental burden of prior failure lingered, influencing decision-making and risk assessment across all levels of command. Operational planning shifted from bold, rapid offensives to carefully calculated strikes designed to minimize risk. Each mission was meticulously assessed, with commanders weighing potential gains against the likelihood of catastrophic loss. The psychological scars of Midway, fear of surprise, mistrust of intelligence, and the memory of sudden annihilation permeated every tactical discussion. At the strategic level, Japan increasingly relied on defensive measures. Island fortifications were reinforced, carrier movements made more cautious, and air patrols extended to detect potential American incursions. Yet these defensive postures, born from caution and trauma, often limited operational flexibility, allowing the Americans to dictate the tempo of engagements. Psychologically, the long-term impact was profound. Commanders, pilots, and crews carried the memory of Midway into every campaign, shaping perceptions of risk, opportunity, and enemy capability. Confidence, once a defining trait of Japanese naval culture, was now tempered by fear and reflection. Decisions were no longer guided solely by doctrine or ambition, but were heavily influenced by the lessons of sudden and overwhelming defeat. Midway had thus redefined Japanese strategy for the remainder of the Pacific War. It was a battle whose effects went far beyond physical destruction, influencing doctrine, training, morale, and psychological resilience. The loss forced Japan to operate in a state of heightened caution, where every action was shadowed by the memory of a single day that had irrevocably changed the balance of power in the Pacific. With Midway behind them, the American Navy recognized an unprecedented opportunity. Japan's carrier supremacy had been broken, and the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted decisively. The U.S. fleet, infused with confidence and strengthened by lessons learned, prepared to transform a single victory into sustained momentum across the theater. Fleet commanders, pilots, and crews internalized the dual lessons of Midway. Preparation and intelligence could shape outcomes, and psychological dominance could tilt engagements before weapons were even deployed. Training intensified, emphasizing precision strikes, coordination between carriers and aircraft, and the ability to exploit enemy hesitation. Each operation was planned with both tactical and mental objectives, designed to reinforce American confidence while destabilizing Japanese resolve. Campaign planning expanded beyond defensive patrols and limited strikes. The U.S. Navy initiated operations across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and other strategic locations, leveraging intelligence to anticipate Japanese movements and strike with overwhelming precision. The psychological impact of Midway lingered. Japanese forces, aware of the Americans' capabilities, approached each encounter with heightened caution, often ceding the initiative. American pilots, buoyed by success, displayed greater audacity and cohesion in air engagements. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters operated in synchronized strikes, maximizing the impact of each sortie. The confidence gained at Midway reinforced discipline, focus, and morale, creating a feedback loop in which mental preparedness amplified operational effectiveness. Meanwhile, intelligence networks continued to inform operations, providing detailed insights into Japanese fleet movements and intentions. Every intercepted signal and reconnaissance report was not merely tactical information but a psychological lever, enabling American commanders to anticipate enemy decisions and maintain strategic initiative. The sustained offensive momentum reshaped the Pacific campaign. Japanese forces were increasingly reactive, compelled to defend positions rather than seize them, and often constrained by caution born from prior defeat. American forces, conversely, advanced with both confidence and calculation, projecting power across vast distances and exploiting vulnerabilities exposed by Midway. In essence, Midway had not only destroyed carriers and inflicted casualties, it had created a psychological and operational upper hand that the U.S. Navy could extend across the Pacific. Victory was no longer measured solely by sunk ships or downed planes, but by the ability to dictate the tempo of war, to compel the enemy to react, and to maintain the mental edge that would define engagements for months and years to come. The battle had set a precedent. With preparation, intelligence, and psychological leverage, the Americans could transform a single engagement into a long-term strategic advantage, projecting power and confidence across an entire theater of war. Midway was not merely a victory. It was a foundation upon which the Pacific campaign would be built. The victory at Midway provided more than morale. It offered strategic latitude. American commanders now had the initiative, and the Pacific became a canvas for coordinated offensives designed to exploit Japan's weakened fleet, disrupted morale, and overextended resources. Midway had broken the myth of invincibility, and the U.S. Navy was determined to maintain pressure across multiple fronts. Operations began to expand geographically and operationally. Task forces moved with precision from the Central Pacific toward the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Gilberts. Each operation leveraged intelligence, reconnaissance, and calculated timing. The psychological impact of the American advance was immediate. Japanese commanders, conditioned by Midway, approached each encounter with caution, often ceding ground or delaying engagement. American pilots and sailors carried the confidence gained at Midway into these campaigns. Precision and coordination became hallmarks of U.S. operations. Dive-bombing runs, torpedo attacks, and fighter sweeps were meticulously rehearsed, executed with a synchronization that amplified their effectiveness. Every successful strike reinforced the belief that preparation and intelligence could overcome even the most entrenched defenses. The Japanese, meanwhile, were forced into reactive measures. Defensive positions were reinforced, carrier movements became measured and deliberate, and air patrols intensified. The fear of sudden strikes from unseen forces, a lesson seared into memory at Midway, shaped every operational decision. Hesitation, born of psychological trauma, slowed response times and reduced the effectiveness of Japanese counterattacks. Logistical and strategic planning also reflected the long-term effects of Midway. The Americans ensured supply lines were secure, enabling sustained operations over vast distances. Intelligence networks expanded, improving situational awareness and allowing commanders to anticipate Japanese deployments. Each success on the battlefield reinforced the psychological momentum that had begun at Midway, creating a cascading advantage that extended across campaigns and months. The cumulative effect was unmistakable. The initiative now rested with the United States. Midway had done more than destroy carriers. It had shifted the mental and operational balance of the Pacific War. The Americans could dictate the pace of conflict, while the Japanese were forced to react, constrained by fear, caution, and a lingering awareness of vulnerability. Every island, every skirmish, every carrier strike became part of a broader strategic narrative. The psychological edge gained at Midway translated into operational dominance, shaping campaigns, eroding enemy confidence, and setting the tone for the long, grueling series of battles that would follow across the Pacific. The aftermath of Midway underscored a fundamental truth of the Pacific War. Battles were won not solely by ships or planes, but by the minds and morale of those who crewed them. Both the Japanese and American navies recognized that psychological resilience was as critical as technical skill in determining the outcome of future engagements. For the Japanese, the lessons were harsh. Pilots and sailors carried the trauma of Midway into every mission, aware of the catastrophic consequences of error. Training regimens were intensified to rebuild confidence, with surviving veterans mentoring new recruits in both tactics and mental endurance. Exercises were designed not only to develop proficiency in navigation, gunnery, and air combat, but also to condition personnel to manage fear, stress, and hesitation under the pressures of battle. Yet psychological recovery proved challenging. The sudden and overwhelming loss of carriers and comrades had instilled a deep-seated caution among Japanese forces. Decision-making was frequently slowed by the fear of repeating past mistakes. Even experienced commanders struggled to balance aggressive strategy with the instinctive caution born of trauma. The mental burden of Midway became a persistent operational factor, influencing risk assessment and engagement tactics across subsequent campaigns. American forces, in contrast, leveraged Midway as a confidence-building triumph. Crew morale soared, grounded not merely in victory but in validated doctrine and precise execution. Training emphasized the integration of psychological preparedness with tactical skill. Pilots rehearsed complex maneuvers under simulated stress conditions. Deck crews practiced rapid aircraft deployment and recovery with disciplined intensity. Officers reinforced decision-making under high-pressure scenarios. Psychological resilience became a strategic asset. Confidence, reinforced through rigorous training and past success, allowed American forces to maintain initiative across extended operations. The mental readiness of pilots, crews, and commanders directly enhanced operational efficiency, enabling rapid coordination, audacious maneuvers, and precise execution in subsequent campaigns. Both sides understood that the Pacific theater demanded mental endurance alongside physical capability. Morale, discipline, and confidence became critical determinants of success. Midway had proven that even the best ships and aircraft could be rendered ineffective if crews faltered under pressure. Conversely, a well-prepared and mentally resilient crew could amplify technological and numerical advantages, transforming strategy into decisive action. The psychological battlefield extended beyond individual competence. Fleet commanders had to maintain cohesion, enforce discipline, and inspire confidence across thousands of personnel under constant threat. Every operational decision was informed by an understanding of morale, mental endurance, and the capacity to respond effectively under stress. Midway had not only redefined naval tactics, but had revealed the indispensable role of human psychology in the theater of war. The Battle of Midway left a lasting imprint on the strategic approach of both the Japanese and American navies. Its lessons transcended the immediate tactical victory, shaping doctrine, fleet coordination, and the psychological calculus of future operations across the Pacific. For the Japanese, Midway became a cautionary reference point. High Command re-evaluated offensive strategies, acknowledging that overconfidence and underestimation of enemy capabilities could lead to catastrophic losses. Carrier tactics were revised to incorporate increased reconnaissance, dispersed formations, and contingency planning for unexpected American interventions. Every deployment was now weighed against the memory of sudden defeat, creating a culture of cautious, deliberate decision-making. Japanese training programs were adapted to emphasize both technical skill and psychological resilience. Pilots and sailors were drilled in scenarios designed to replicate the chaos and surprise of Midway, attempting to condition them for the possibility of sudden engagement or disaster. Yet, despite rigorous preparation, the shadow of past failure continued to influence risk assessment, operational tempo, and command initiative. On the American side, Midway validated the integration of intelligence into operational strategy. Cryptanalysis, reconnaissance, and tactical foresight had enabled victory, demonstrating that knowledge could dictate the tempo of warfare as decisively as firepower. Fleet coordination was refined to optimize carrier task force movements, airstrike timing, and logistical support, ensuring that subsequent campaigns were informed by both strategic insight and psychological advantage. The U.S. Navy capitalized on this momentum to design long-term operational plans that emphasized flexibility, speed, and precision. Intelligence-driven strikes became a hallmark of Pacific operations, and crews were trained to execute coordinated attacks under complex, high-pressure conditions. Midway had proven that preparation, discipline, and foresight could enable a smaller or outnumbered force to prevail, and this principle became embedded in American doctrine. Psychological considerations remained central. American commanders recognized that demonstrating confidence, coordination, and competence could unsettle the Japanese, shaping behavior before physical engagement occurred. Conversely, Japanese caution, a direct result of Midway, often slowed operational response, providing the U.S. Navy with critical strategic advantages. The battle's legacy extended into campaign planning, island-hopping strategies, and the deployment of combined arms forces. Midway had shown that control of the seas, mastery of air power, and psychological dominance were intertwined, and that sustained success depended on leveraging each factor in concert. Fleet movements, aerial reconnaissance, and tactical execution were all informed by the enduring lessons of June 1942. In essence, Midway became more than a battle. It became a doctrinal cornerstone. Both sides adapted their approach to warfare in response to its outcomes, but the U.S. Navy emerged with a decisive combination of operational flexibility, intelligence integration, and psychological leverage that would guide the remainder of the Pacific campaign. The legacy of Midway was thus strategic, operational, and profoundly human, shaping the course of the war across thousands of miles of ocean. Beyond the ships and strategy, the Battle of Midway was defined by the human experiences etched into every deck, cockpit, and lifeboat. Each carrier, whether Japanese or American, carried crews whose lives would be forever altered by the fury of combat, the chaos of explosions, and the relentless demands of survival. For Japanese sailors aboard Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the day began like any other, yet it ended in devastation. Pilots launched in waves, unaware that American dive bombers had already located their carriers. Sailors below deck fought fires and attempted to salvage machinery, often facing impossible odds. The roar of bombs and the heat of burning fuel created a surreal environment, in which courage and instinct determined who would survive. Some Japanese pilots, thrown into chaotic dogfights with American fighters, displayed extraordinary skill and bravery, maneuvering to avoid destruction while attempting to strike back. Others were forced to ditch their aircraft over open water, confronting both the threat of enemy fire and the terrifying expanse of the Pacific. Lifeboats became temporary sanctuaries, carrying survivors through hours and days of uncertainty before rescue could arrive. On the American side, courage manifested in equal measure, albeit under different circumstances. Pilots of the USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown executed meticulously coordinated dive-bombing runs, knowing that precision was the difference between sinking an enemy carrier and losing their own lives. Deck crews worked tirelessly under fire, launching aircraft with speed and discipline while engulfed in smoke and the echo of distant explosions. Every individual faced the dual pressures of fear and duty. For both Japanese and American personnel, survival depended not only on skill but on psychological resilience, the ability to act decisively in the face of chaos, to maintain focus despite loss, and to uphold the trust between comrades in life-or-death situations. Stories of heroism and sacrifice emerged from every corner of the battlefield. Sailors who guided damaged ships to safety, pilots who returned with empty fuel tanks after successful attacks, and officers who coordinated operations under constant bombardment became emblematic of the human spirit within the war. Even those who perished contributed to the larger narrative, their lives a testament to the stakes of naval warfare and the profound cost of strategic decisions. Midway was, ultimately, a collision of human endurance, technological might, and strategic insight. Ships could be rebuilt, aircraft replaced, and doctrines revised, but the experiences of those who survived, or did not, left indelible marks on the course of the war. Courage, fear, loss, and survival intertwined to create a human tapestry as vast and complex as the Pacific itself. The Battle of Midway's influence extended far beyond the immediate destruction of 4 Japanese carriers. Its lessons radiated across the Pacific, affecting strategy, tactics, and the very psychology of naval and air personnel for the remainder of the war. For Japan, the ripple effect was immediate and enduring. The loss of experienced pilots and key officers forced a reassessment of training, deployment, and risk management. Commanders became acutely aware that American forces could anticipate moves with precision, instilling caution in operations that had once been characterized by boldness and decisiveness. Even minor decisions, whether the timing of aircraft launches or the positioning of carriers, were now influenced by the psychological weight of Midway's sudden and devastating losses. American forces, conversely, gained not only operational momentum but a psychological upper hand that reinforced confidence and initiative. Pilots, crew members, and fleet commanders internalized the notion that preparation, intelligence, and coordination could overcome numerical or technological disadvantage. This understanding encouraged a proactive approach to campaigns, where the U.S. Navy often dictated the tempo, forcing the Japanese to react rather than act on their own terms. Midway's human lessons also shaped training and leadership. For the Japanese, Teaching resilience under fire became a strategic priority, attempting to cultivate mental toughness in pilots who might face similarly overwhelming odds. For Americans, training increasingly incorporated stress simulations, coordinated maneuvers under duress, and exercises designed to maintain composure during chaotic combat conditions. Psychological readiness became a decisive factor in mission success. Subsequent campaigns, from the Solomon Islands to New Guinea, reflected these adjustments. Japanese defensive postures were marked by caution and hesitancy, while American offensives emphasized calculated aggression and coordinated strikes. Even the planning of supply lines, reconnaissance, and carrier group movements was informed by the enduring influence of Midway, where knowledge of the enemy's capabilities and likely reactions proved as decisive as firepower. The ripple effect extended to morale as well. For Japanese sailors and pilots, the memory of Midway served as a persistent reminder of vulnerability and loss, shaping expectations and caution in every engagement. For Americans, it was a source of proof that meticulous planning, intelligence, and precision could achieve results disproportionate to force size, reinforcing discipline and confidence across successive campaigns. Ultimately, Midway had created a psychological and operational paradigm. Battles were no longer isolated events. Every engagement was connected to lessons learned, perceptions formed, and strategies adjusted. Across the vast Pacific, the mental and emotional dimensions of warfare became inseparable from tactical and strategic calculations. Midway's legacy was felt in the nervous anticipation of Japanese forces and the calculated confidence of Americans, shaping the war long after the last bomb had fallen. The Battle of Midway did not merely reshape tactics and morale. It revolutionized the role of intelligence in naval warfare. The decisive victory demonstrated that accurate information, timely analysis, and predictive insight could dictate outcomes even against numerically superior forces. For the Americans, code-breaking had been the linchpin. Cryptographers, working tirelessly to decipher Japanese communications, provided actionable intelligence that allowed commanders to anticipate fleet movements, identify carrier locations, and plan precise counterstrikes. Midway proved that information could serve as a weapon as lethal as any torpedo or bomb, and the lessons learned would permanently integrate intelligence into every aspect of Pacific operations. Reconnaissance assumed a heightened role. Patrol aircraft, submarines, and scouting missions were tasked not just with detecting enemy positions, but with providing continuous data for predictive strategic planning. The fusion of intelligence gathering with operational execution became a hallmark of American doctrine. Every sortie, every report, was analyzed for both tactical value and psychological insight, understanding how knowledge, or the perception of it, could influence enemy behavior. For Japan, the shock of Midway underscored vulnerabilities in communications and operational security. The realization that American cryptographers had penetrated their codes forced a re-evaluation of command procedures and signal discipline. Attempts to secure information often conflicted with operational needs, introducing delays and uncertainty that would impact future campaigns. The Japanese Navy faced the difficult reality that in modern warfare, superior technology and numbers could be neutralized by intelligence failures. The psychological dimension of intelligence became increasingly important. For Japanese crews, the possibility that their plans were known in advance induced caution, hesitation, and stress. American commanders, aware of this, leveraged intelligence to exert mental pressure, shaping the enemy's decisions and movements without a single shot fired. The battle had revealed that strategic insight could extend the battlefield into the mind of the adversary. In subsequent operations, intelligence-driven warfare became standard. U.S. forces used code-breaking, surveillance, and reconnaissance not only to plan attacks but to manipulate perception, creating uncertainty and hesitation within Japanese ranks. Midway had set a precedent. Information was not just a supplement to force. It was an equal, sometimes decisive, element in naval power projection. The revolution of naval intelligence following Midway transformed the Pacific War. Fleets moved with foresight, strikes were coordinated with predictive precision, and mental advantage was pursued as actively as physical dominance. The battle had proven that knowledge could win wars, and both strategy and psychology would henceforth be inseparably intertwined. The shockwaves of Midway rippled through the Pacific, transforming not only battles but the very nature of naval warfare across thousands of miles of ocean. The loss of 4 carriers and experienced personnel forced Japan to shift from aggressive expansion to defensive caution, while the United States leveraged both the physical and psychological momentum to reshape operational strategy. Japanese commanders, previously confident in their superiority, now operated under the constant awareness of vulnerability. Carrier task forces moved with heightened caution, reconnaissance and intelligence were emphasized, often at the cost of speed and initiative. Every engagement became a calculated risk, influenced not only by tactical considerations but by the lingering fear of unforeseen strikes and the memory of sudden defeat. American forces, in contrast, embraced a newfound freedom of action. Commanders used the lessons of Midway to plan coordinated offensives, projecting power across the Central and South Pacific. Carrier groups were deployed with flexibility, airstrikes were executed with precision, and intelligence networks ensured that operations were informed by predictive insight. Confidence, rooted in both experience and preparation, allowed American forces to dictate the tempo of engagements, forcing Japan into a reactive posture. The transformation extended beyond individual battles. Training programs for pilots, sailors, and officers emphasized integration of intelligence, psychological readiness, and technical proficiency. Operational doctrines were revised to prioritize speed, coordination, and the exploitation of enemy hesitation. Even supply and logistics planning incorporated psychological considerations, ensuring that forces could maintain momentum while projecting confidence and control. Psychological warfare became a central feature of the Pacific Campaign. Japanese forces, haunted by Midway, faced persistent mental pressure, influencing decision-making, risk assessment, and the willingness to engage. American forces, reinforced by confidence and doctrine, used this advantage to amplify operational effectiveness. The Pacific had become a theater where morale, perception, and mental fortitude were as critical as ships, aircraft, and weapons. The cumulative effect of these changes was profound. Midway had not only destroyed carriers and shifted material balance, it had altered strategies, doctrines, and the mental frameworks of both navies. The Americans seized the initiative, Japan was forced into cautious defense, and the war evolved into a contest defined by preparation, intelligence, and psychological advantage as much as by physical firepower. From the open ocean to fortified islands, from flight decks to command rooms, the transformation was total. Midway had redrawn the map of power, rewritten operational principles, and embedded the psychological dimension into every aspect of Pacific warfare. The stage was set for a long, grueling campaign in which every decision, every sortie, and every engagement would be shaped by the lessons learned on that pivotal day in June 1942. The legacy of Midway extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of June 1942. Its impact shaped campaigns, influenced morale, and guided strategic planning throughout the remaining years of the Pacific War. The battle had proven that a single engagement, executed with intelligence, precision, and courage, could alter the trajectory of an entire theater. For the Japanese Navy, the psychological scars of Midway lingered. Commanders approached operations with heightened caution, balancing aggression with the knowledge of their fleet's vulnerabilities. Pilots, many of whom had survived Midway, carried the memory of sudden losses into subsequent missions, influencing decision-making and risk assessment. Training and recruitment programs attempted to mitigate the loss of experienced personnel, but the shadow of Midway persisted, coloring every engagement. American forces, by contrast, translated the lessons of Midway into sustained operational momentum. Carrier groups, bolstered by intelligence networks and rigorous training, advanced across the Central and South Pacific with unprecedented coordination. Every campaign, from the Solomons to New Guinea, reflected the principles validated at Midway: preparation, intelligence, coordination, and psychological leverage. Pilots and sailors internalized the value of these lessons, carrying both skill and confidence into combat. The battle also redefined strategic doctrine. The importance of aircraft carriers, once underestimated, became central to naval operations. Air superiority was recognized as a decisive factor, capable of determining both the physical and psychological outcome of engagements. Intelligence and reconnaissance were integrated into every decision, ensuring that commanders could anticipate enemy movements, exploit weaknesses, and apply pressure even before contact. Midway's influence extended to morale as well. For American crews, the victory reinforced belief in their training, doctrine, and leadership. Confidence became a force multiplier, enhancing effectiveness in subsequent operations. Japanese morale, conversely, was challenged by the memory of sudden defeat, influencing both operational caution and the psychological readiness of pilots and sailors alike. In essence, the long reach of Midway transformed the Pacific War from a contest of attrition to a complex interplay of strategy, intelligence, and human psychology. Each subsequent campaign bore its imprint, from tactical maneuvers to the mental state of personnel. The battle had demonstrated that mastery of information, preparation, and mental resilience could outweigh numerical advantage, a lesson that would define engagements across the Pacific for years to come. Midway had become more than a historical event. It was a touchstone for strategy, a reference point for operational planning, and a lasting testament to the decisive role of human courage, preparation, and psychological acumen in the theater of war. Midway did more than destroy carriers and shift the balance of power. It catalyzed a technological and strategic evolution that reshaped the Pacific theater. Both the United States and Japan recognized that future victories would require innovation, adaptation, and integration of lessons learned from the battle. For the Japanese Navy, the losses at Midway highlighted vulnerabilities in carrier design, aircraft capabilities, and fleet coordination. Efforts were made to improve damage control, accelerate aircraft maintenance, and develop more resilient formations. New training programs aimed to create pilots capable of surviving high-intensity engagements and executing precise strikes under pressure. Despite these measures, Japan faced a fundamental challenge. The attrition of veteran aviators could not be quickly replaced, and the psychological impact of Midway continued to influence operational decisions. The U.S. Navy, emboldened by its success, accelerated technological innovation. Aircraft carriers were optimized for faster launches and recoveries. Flight decks and hangars were redesigned to improve operational efficiency. Fighter aircraft, including the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair, were deployed in increasing numbers, designed to counter the Japanese Zero with superior speed, firepower, and resilience. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers were refined for greater accuracy, while coordinated strike tactics were continuously developed and rehearsed. Tactical evolution mirrored technological changes. American carrier groups implemented layered air defense, combining fighters and bombers in coordinated formations to protect ships while projecting offensive power. Reconnaissance and intelligence integration became standard, allowing task forces to anticipate enemy movements and strike with precision. Japanese forces, attempting to recover from Midway, adapted by dispersing carriers, increasing fighter cover, and modifying aircrew tactics, but the psychological and numerical advantages had shifted irrevocably to the Americans. Beyond individual ships and aircraft, operational doctrine evolved. Midway had demonstrated the decisive power of intelligence, coordination, and timing. Fleet commanders learned to integrate these elements into cohesive campaigns, ensuring that preparation, reconnaissance, and psychological leverage were as critical as firepower. Every maneuver, every strike, and every engagement was informed by this new understanding of naval warfare. The evolution was both strategic and human. Pilots and crews trained to operate in high-stress, high-precision environments. Officers coordinated complex operations with awareness that timing, intelligence, and confidence could determine the outcome before the first bomb hit its target. The theater itself had changed. The Pacific was no longer just a stage for brute force, but a domain where strategy, technology, and psychology intertwined to decide the fate of fleets and the men who served upon them. Midway had been the catalyst, and its lessons reverberated through every subsequent engagement. The evolution of ships, aircraft, and tactics was not simply a response to loss. It was an affirmation that victory depended on adaptation, preparation, and the ability to integrate human, technological, and strategic elements into a unified force capable of dominating the vast Pacific theater. Following Midway, the importance of air superiority became an undeniable cornerstone of Pacific strategy. The battle had proven that control of the skies could determine the outcome of naval engagements, dictate fleet movements, and exert psychological pressure on enemy forces long before contact with surface ships. For the United States, this realization spurred the development and deployment of advanced fighter aircraft capable of outperforming Japanese Zeros in speed, firepower, and durability. The F-6F Hellcat, introduced in significant numbers after Midway, became the embodiment of this strategy, a plane designed not only to survive dogfights but to dominate them. Carrier air groups were trained to employ coordinated tactics, leveraging the Hellcat's capabilities to protect American fleets and neutralize enemy aircraft before they could strike. The Japanese, in contrast, faced an uphill struggle. Losses of experienced pilots at Midway had created a skill gap that could not be immediately filled. New aircraft designs, including the A6M50, attempted to maintain aerial superiority, but the Americans' growing technological edge, combined with improved tactics, steadily eroded Japanese dominance in the air. The psychological impact of this shift was profound. Pilots, once confident in their ability to control engagements, now faced adversaries who could anticipate, outmaneuver, and overwhelm them. Air combat became a central determinant of strategy. American fighter sweeps, coordinated with dive bombers and torpedo planes, allowed task forces to conduct strikes with unprecedented efficiency. Japanese carriers, aware of the increasing threat in the skies, were forced into defensive postures, often dispersing forces or delaying attacks to minimize exposure. Even minor reconnaissance flights became high-stakes operations, as the potential for interception by American fighters introduced both tactical risk and psychological strain. The consequences were not merely physical. Air superiority reshaped decision-making at every level. Fleet commanders accounted for enemy air power in positioning carriers, timing strikes, and planning maneuvers. Pilots internalized the need for discipline, formation cohesion, and coordinated action, understanding that a lapse in concentration could result in catastrophic loss. The mental dimension of air combat, anticipating enemy moves, managing stress, and maintaining composure under fire, became as decisive as technical skill or aircraft performance. Across the Pacific, control of the skies created a feedback loop. Confidence and morale among American forces grew as their air superiority proved decisive, while Japanese forces experienced increased caution, hesitancy, and psychological pressure. Midway had demonstrated the potential of air power to shape the course of battle, and in the months and years that followed, the struggle for aerial dominance became a defining feature of the Pacific War. Air combat was no longer an isolated contest between pilots. It had become the linchpin of strategy, a psychological lever, and a force multiplier for operations across the vast and contested expanses of the Pacific Ocean. Midway had shown the way, and both sides adjusted to the reality that mastery of the skies was now essential for survival and success. The Battle of Midway had shifted the strategic momentum, allowing the United States to move from defensive operations to calculated, offensive campaigns across the Pacific. One of the most significant applications of Midway's lessons was the island-hopping strategy, a methodical approach to seizing strategically critical islands while bypassing heavily fortified positions. American planners recognized that the combination of intelligence, air superiority, and psychological leverage could dictate success in amphibious operations. Reconnaissance, both aerial and naval, identified key objectives where Japanese forces were vulnerable. By concentrating forces on these points, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps could maximize the impact of each assault while minimizing casualties and conserving resources. Midway had shown the value of precise intelligence, and it became a guiding principle for every subsequent landing. Air and naval support was central to island hopping. Carriers provided continuous air cover, neutralizing Japanese air threats before they could jeopardize landing forces. Dive bombers and torpedo planes struck fortifications and supply lines, while fighter sweeps ensured control of the skies. Psychological effects were also considered. Demonstrating overwhelming air and naval power discouraged resistance, reduced the effectiveness of enemy morale, and pressured Japanese commanders to either retreat or fight under disadvantageous conditions. Logistics, another lesson reinforced by Midway, became a decisive factor. Ensuring the steady flow of troops, equipment, and supplies across thousands of miles of ocean required meticulous planning and coordination. American forces developed sophisticated amphibious doctrines, emphasizing speed, flexibility, and adaptability. Troops were trained to respond to unexpected challenges, including enemy counterattacks, difficult terrain, and complex coordination between naval, air, and ground units. Japanese defenders, aware of the psychological and material impact of American preparations, often found themselves in reactive postures. The memory of Midway's sudden and overwhelming strikes contributed to hesitation and cautious decision-making. Even fortified islands could not fully compensate for the loss of initiative and the constant threat of American air and naval dominance. The island-hopping campaign exemplified the integration of operational, technological, and psychological lessons. Each landing, assault, and bombardment was part of a broader strategy informed by Midway. Preparation, intelligence, air superiority, and morale could achieve decisive results even against determined resistance. The campaign demonstrated that victory depended on more than brute force. It required foresight, coordination, and the ability to exploit both physical and mental advantages. In the months following Midway, islands such as Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan became arenas where these principles were tested and perfected. Every successful operation reinforced the psychological momentum gained at Midway, while eroding Japanese confidence and initiative. The battle's legacy extended far beyond the carriers lost. It shaped the doctrine, execution, and mindset that would guide America's advance across the Pacific, one island at a time. While aircraft and carriers dominated headlines, another crucial dimension of the Pacific War evolved in the wake of Midway: submarine warfare. The decisive battle had demonstrated the vulnerability of Japanese carriers and supply lines, highlighting the potential for undersea forces to exploit these weaknesses with precision and stealth. American submarines, often operating alone or in small wolf packs, targeted Japanese merchant convoys, warships, and critical supply routes. Midway had underscored the importance of intelligence and timing, principles now applied beneath the waves. Submarine commanders used decoded Japanese communications and reconnaissance reports to anticipate movements, selecting the most opportune moments to strike and maximize disruption. The psychological effect on the Japanese was profound. Sailors and commanders became acutely aware that threats could emerge unseen, anywhere along their vast supply chains. Merchant vessels, essential for transporting troops, fuel, and equipment, were particularly vulnerable. The constant presence of American submarines induced fear, slowed movements, and forced the diversion of escort ships, altering Japanese strategic calculations. Technological and tactical innovation followed. Torpedoes were refined for greater reliability, while sonar and depth-charge countermeasures advanced to meet new threats. Submarine crews were trained for endurance and stealth, learning to navigate vast distances, evade detection, and launch attacks with precision under immense pressure. The human element, the resilience, patience, and courage of crews, was as critical as machinery. Operations were increasingly integrated with surface fleets and air reconnaissance. Aircraft carriers and patrol planes identified targets, relaying coordinates to submarine commanders who struck with surgical efficiency. These coordinated efforts multiplied the effects of each attack, creating a continuous, pervasive threat that forced the Japanese to operate defensively across multiple dimensions. Midway had shown that even the mightiest fleet could be vulnerable to well-informed, concentrated attacks. Submarine warfare extended this lesson into the undersea domain, where patience, preparation, and psychological pressure became weapons as lethal as bombs and guns. The silent hunters beneath the Pacific disrupted logistics, sapped morale, and further eroded the Japanese Navy's ability to dictate the pace of war. By combining intelligence, tactical innovation, and human endurance, American submarines became pivotal in the Pacific campaign. The battle had proven that dominance was not only about striking first or hardest, it was about controlling the environment, exploiting vulnerabilities, and exerting psychological pressure across every level of the theater, from the surface of the water to the depths below. Midway had not only reshaped battles and tactics, but also revealed the critical importance of logistics and supply lines in sustaining naval and air operations across the sprawling Pacific theater. The battle demonstrated that even the most powerful fleet could falter without reliable access to fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and provisions, a lesson the United States and Japan would both take to heart. For the United States, control of key islands and maritime routes allowed the creation of forward bases, fueling stations, and supply depots, extending operational reach. The capture and fortification of Midway itself became an emblematic example. Its airfields, docks, and storage facilities provided both a strategic buffer and a logistical hub. Every offensive operation relied on meticulous planning, ensuring that ships and aircraft could be resupplied rapidly and efficiently, sustaining the momentum gained after Midway. American logistical planning emphasized redundancy and flexibility. Convoys were coordinated with intelligence to avoid Japanese interception, while escort vessels and aircraft provided protection along vital routes. Engineers and supply officers worked tirelessly to maintain forward operating bases, repair damaged ships, and ensure that the continuous tempo of operations could be maintained across thousands of miles of ocean. The Japanese Navy, reeling from the loss of carriers and veteran pilots at Midway, faced severe logistical challenges. Supply lines became vulnerable to submarine attacks, airstrikes, and surface raids. The disruption of fuel and material deliveries forced Japan to adopt a more cautious approach, limiting offensive operations and delaying reinforcements. Commanders struggled to maintain operational tempo while protecting critical choke points, often sacrificing initiative for survival. Psychological factors played a role in logistics as well. American forces, aware of Japanese supply vulnerabilities, used their control of key choke points to pressure enemy forces into defensive postures. Japanese crews, constantly aware of potential interdiction, operated under persistent stress, knowing that a single convoy lost could have strategic consequences far beyond the immediate material loss. Midway had illuminated the interdependence of strategy, operational reach, and logistics. Victory depended not only on firepower or courage, but also on the ability to sustain forces over vast distances, anticipate enemy interdiction, and maintain the flow of critical resources. Control of supply lines became both a tactical and psychological lever, shaping the planning, execution, and outcomes of every Pacific campaign. In essence, the battle underscored a timeless military principle. Strategy is only as effective as the infrastructure that supports it. Midway's lessons extended from the bridge of a carrier to the warehouses of distant bases, from the deck crews of submarines to the engineers maintaining supply convoys, proving that logistics could be decisive in shaping both opportunity and outcome in the Pacific theater. The Battle of Midway highlighted a truth as enduring as the ships themselves. The outcome of war often hinges not solely on firepower or technology, but on the minds of those in command. From fleet admirals to air squadron leaders, Midway underscored the immense psychological pressures of decision-making under uncertainty, chaos, and life-or-death stakes. American commanders, such as Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, exemplified calm, analytical leadership. Having carefully studied intelligence reports, Nimitz positioned his limited carrier forces to exploit the Japanese fleet's vulnerabilities. His decisions balanced calculated risk with strategic foresight, demonstrating that leadership requires both courage and patience. The ability to anticipate enemy moves, to weigh probabilities, and to commit forces at the right moment proved decisive in shaping the battle's outcome. Japanese leadership faced contrasting pressures. Admirals and carrier captains operated under the weight of expectation, tradition, and the memory of previous victories. Midway's sudden losses forced rapid reassessment, revealing the dangers of overconfidence and the psychological strain of command. Risk-taking, once a hallmark of Japanese naval culture, was tempered by caution, a direct result of Midway's shock, which influenced every subsequent maneuver and operational decision. Decision-making in combat was not purely intellectual, it was deeply psychological. Commanders had to interpret incomplete information, predict enemy behavior, and commit men and machines to courses of action with imperfect knowledge. Stress, fatigue, and the fear of catastrophic loss shaped every choice. Midway revealed that mental acuity under duress could determine the difference between victory and disaster. The human dimension extended down the chain of command. Squadron leaders and ship captains internalized both the tactical lessons and the psychological demands of Midway. Pilots had to make split-second choices in dogfights, navigators had to chart courses under enemy fire, and deck crews had to launch aircraft with precision under extreme stress. The ability to remain composed, make decisions under pressure, and maintain confidence in the face of chaos became as critical as technical skill. Furthermore, Midway illustrated the power of anticipation and deception in command psychology. Leaders who could predict enemy responses, exploit hesitation, and shape perception often gained an advantage even before engagements began. American forces leveraged these principles effectively, while the Japanese, constrained by caution and lingering fear, frequently ceded initiative. In the broader scope of the Pacific War, the psychology of command became a defining factor. Battles were won not just by strategy or firepower, but by leaders' capacity to integrate intelligence, risk assessment, and human psychology into decisive action. Midway was as much a testament to the minds guiding fleets as to the fleets themselves, a lesson that would influence every engagement that followed. The Battle of Midway did more than redefine a single engagement. It catalyzed a profound transformation in naval doctrine for both the United States and Japan. Lessons learned in June 1942 were institutionalized, reshaping the strategies, tactics, and operational philosophies that would guide the remainder of the Pacific War. For the United States, Midway reinforced the value of intelligence-driven operations. Naval doctrine increasingly emphasized the integration of cryptography, reconnaissance, and predictive analysis into every level of planning. Carrier task forces were no longer just vessels of firepower. They became flexible, intelligence-centric platforms capable of projecting coordinated, multidimensional force across vast oceanic distances. Strike groups, air cover, and logistical support were harmonized into cohesive operations, with timing, positioning, and psychological leverage dictating success as much as ordnance. Training protocols evolved in response. Pilots, sailors, and officers were subjected to rigorous exercises simulating surprise attacks, coordination challenges, and high-stress combat scenarios. Crew cohesion and rapid decision-making became central tenets, ensuring that forces could execute complex maneuvers with precision even under intense pressure. The doctrine stressed that the human element, mental preparation, discipline, and confidence, was inseparable from technical and tactical capability. Japanese naval doctrine also shifted, albeit under the shadow of caution. The devastating losses at Midway prompted greater emphasis on defensive coordination, dispersal of assets, and protective formations for carriers. Reconnaissance became prioritized to avoid ambushes, while operational planning increasingly incorporated contingency measures to mitigate sudden losses. However, the psychological impact of Midway, fear of surprise, hesitation in risk-taking, and erosion of veteran pilot experience often limited Japan's ability to translate doctrine into effective aggressive action. The battle also prompted re-evaluation of the balance between air and naval power. The dominance of aircraft in sinking carriers underscored the necessity of air superiority for both offense and defense. American doctrine, in particular, integrated layered air defense and precision strike capability into carrier operations, establishing a model that would guide every Pacific campaign thereafter. Operational flexibility became a hallmark of post-Midway doctrine. Task forces were designed to respond to evolving situations, with decision-making decentralized to allow for rapid adaptation during engagements. Combined arms, surface ships, submarines, and aircraft were coordinated in ways that leveraged intelligence, technology, and psychology simultaneously, creating operational synergy that magnified effectiveness beyond raw numbers. Ultimately, Midway transformed naval doctrine into an integrated system of strategy, technology, human psychology, and intelligence. Both nations codified lessons from the battle, but the United States, benefiting from initiative, confidence, and adaptability, gained a doctrinal edge. Japanese responses, constrained by caution and attrition, struggled to regain the initiative. The evolution of naval doctrine post-Midway was not merely about ships and planes. It was a transformation in thought, emphasizing foresight, preparation, and the complex interplay of human and technological factors in modern naval warfare. Midway irrevocably demonstrated that aircraft carriers had become the decisive instruments of naval power. Battleships, once the pride of any fleet, were increasingly relegated to supporting roles, while carriers emerged as the primary offensive and defensive platforms in the Pacific theater. This shift forced both the United States and Japan to reimagine fleet composition, deployment, and engagement strategy. For the Americans, carrier operations evolved into highly coordinated, multi-layered tactics designed to maximize flexibility and lethality. Air groups were organized to strike in waves, fighters provided air cover, dive bombers targeted enemy ships, and torpedo planes attacked from multiple vectors. Such coordination required precise timing, extensive training, and the integration of real-time intelligence. Midway had shown that even a numerically inferior force could achieve disproportionate results if carriers were employed with precision and foresight. Japanese carrier tactics, shaped by the memory of Midway, became more conservative. Emphasis shifted to layered defense, with combat air patrols positioned to intercept incoming threats and carriers dispersed to reduce vulnerability to concentrated attacks. However, this defensive posture often limited offensive initiative, leaving Japanese commanders reactive rather than proactive. The psychological impact of sudden, catastrophic losses continued to influence operational decision-making, reducing the aggressiveness that had characterized pre-Midway strategy. The operational doctrine surrounding carriers also incorporated lessons in coordination with other fleet elements. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were tasked with protecting carriers, providing anti-aircraft fire, and screening against submarine attacks. Submarines, reconnaissance planes, and shore-based intelligence were integrated into a broader operational picture to enhance the carrier's effectiveness. Every element of the fleet worked as part of a synchronized system, with the carrier at its heart. Training and crew preparation were equally vital. A-crews were drilled in complex maneuvers, including coordinated multiplane strikes, evasive tactics, and rapid recovery procedures. Deck crews practiced efficient launch and recovery operations under simulated combat conditions, ensuring that carriers could maintain continuous offensive capability even under duress. Midway had underscored that operational success depended as much on human execution as on technological superiority. The evolution of carrier tactics extended to psychological strategy. Demonstrating air superiority and precise coordination exerted pressure on Japanese commanders, often forcing caution and hesitation. The mere presence of American carriers, capable of rapid, devastating strikes, became a strategic tool in itself, shaping Japanese movements and influencing the tempo of engagements across the Pacific. Midway had ignited the fleet combat revolution. It proved that dominance in the air could decide battles before surface ships even engaged, and that carriers, when coordinated with intelligence, training, and psychological leverage, were the central instruments of modern naval warfare. The lessons learned transformed every subsequent Pacific campaign, redefining naval power for the remainder of World War II. While carriers, aircraft, and doctrine dominated strategic discussions, the Battle of Midway, and every engagement that followed, remained fundamentally a human endeavor. The evolution of naval warfare was inseparable from the experiences, courage, and sacrifices of the men who served aboard ships and in the air. American sailors faced relentless pressure. Deck crews launched aircraft under the threat of enemy fire, managed complex machinery, and coordinated with precision to maintain operational tempo. Pilots embarked on perilous missions, often knowing that enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and mechanical failure could claim their lives in minutes. The training and discipline honed after Midway allowed them to act with efficiency, but fear, fatigue, and the constant awareness of mortality remained constant companions. Japanese sailors and aviators bore their own burdens. The loss of veteran pilots at Midway left inexperienced crews to confront increasingly formidable American forces. They faced both physical danger and psychological strain, knowing that each sortie could end in disaster. Lifeboats, damaged ships, and the open sea became harsh arbiters of survival, testing courage, endurance, and improvisation under extreme conditions. Heroism was not confined to the skies. Damage control teams fought fires, repaired engines, and stabilized listing carriers, often risking life and limb to save comrades and maintain operational capability. Submarine crews endured claustrophobic conditions, operating silently for days beneath enemy patrols, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every engagement, from a fight-to-dogfight to the repair of a damaged deck, was a test of skill, resolve, and collective trust. The human cost was staggering. Casualties were inevitable, and losses weighed heavily on morale. Yet within this grim reality, stories of courage, ingenuity, and camaraderie emerged. Sailors who guided damaged ships to safety, pilots who returned from missions with empty fuel tanks, and officers who coordinated under chaos exemplified the indomitable spirit of those at sea. Their actions turned doctrine into reality and strategy into victory. Psychologically, the human element shaped the war as much as any ship or weapon. Fear, determination, and morale influenced tactical decisions, operational tempo, and the willingness to take risks. Commanders considered not only the physical strength of forces but their mental resilience, understanding that the outcomes of battles often hinged on how crews reacted under extreme stress. Midway had been a stark reminder that technology and strategy alone could not guarantee success. Victory required the skill, courage, and endurance of the men who served aboard carriers, ships, and submarines. Each life, each decision, and each act of heroism contributed to the larger narrative of the Pacific War, a human story intertwined with the machines, tactics, and strategies that dominated headlines. The physical battles of the Pacific were matched by equally intense psychological struggles. Midway had revealed that the human mind could be as decisive a weapon as any torpedo or bomb. Morale, fear, anticipation, and confidence shaped every decision, influencing the outcomes of engagements long before ships or aircraft exchanged fire. For the Japanese Navy, the shock of losing 4 carriers and many experienced pilots at Midway left an enduring psychological scar. Commanders became cautious, weighing every maneuver against the possibility of sudden ambush or intelligence leaks. Pilots, aware of their diminished numbers and the growing competence of American forces, approached missions with heightened stress. The lingering fear of unexpected attacks constrained initiative and fostered hesitation, subtly reshaping Japanese strategic culture in the Pacific. American forces, in contrast, experienced a surge in confidence. Victory at Midway validated training, preparation, and intelligence integration. Pilots and sailors developed an ingrained belief in their ability to execute complex operations successfully. This confidence, cultivated through both planning and battlefield experience, became a force multiplier, enhancing operational effectiveness and decision-making under pressure. Psychological warfare extended beyond the immediate participants. Both sides sought to shape perception, through visible displays of air and naval strength, through propaganda, and through calculated deception. Controlling what the enemy believed to be true could induce hesitation, misallocation of resources, or overextension. Midway had demonstrated the power of foreknowledge and surprise, showing that shaping the enemy's perception could be as deadly as sinking a ship. Within fleets, morale influenced cohesion, discipline, and resilience. Sailors on damaged ships, pilots facing superior numbers, and crews enduring long deployments all relied on mental fortitude to survive and fight effectively. Commanders recognized that maintaining morale was a strategic responsibility, one that could determine the success of entire operations. Leaders provided reassurance, set clear objectives, and fostered trust in both technology and fellow crews, ensuring that fear did not paralyze action. The psychological dimension of warfare also affected operational doctrine. American planners emphasized preparation, intelligence, and coordinated strikes, not merely for tactical advantage but to project power and confidence, forcing the Japanese into reactive postures. Midway had proven that psychological leverage, combined with physical force, could decisively shape the theater. In the years following, morale and mental resilience remained central to Pacific campaigns. Every landing, airstrike, and naval engagement reflected not only strategic and tactical calculations, but the enduring influence of Midway on the minds of commanders and crews. Victory was as much a contest of nerves, perception, and resolve as it was a test of ships, planes, and firepower. The Battle of Midway marked a pivotal turning point, but the struggle for supremacy in the Pacific was far from over. Both the United States and Japan adjusted strategies, technologies, and tactics, understanding that control of the seas, skies, and the minds of combatants was essential for long-term success. American forces capitalized on momentum. Lessons from Midway, carrier coordination, air superiority, intelligence integration, and psychological leverage became the foundation for subsequent campaigns. Task forces were deployed with flexibility, airstrikes executed with precision, and reconnaissance used proactively to anticipate Japanese movements. Confidence in these methods emboldened American commanders to take calculated risks, striking where the enemy was weakest and exploiting any lapse in discipline or coordination. Japan, recovering from Midway, faced daunting challenges. The loss of carriers and veteran pilots forced a more cautious, defensive approach. Carrier task forces were dispersed, reconnaissance intensified, and operational plans included contingencies for surprise attacks. Yet the psychological impact of Midway, awareness of vulnerability and the fear of sudden devastation, often constrained initiative, leaving Japanese forces reacting to American maneuvers rather than setting the tempo themselves. Subsequent carrier engagements, such as the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, reflected this new reality. American forces increasingly dictated the rhythm of combat, leveraging intelligence, coordinated airstrikes, and rapid decision-making. Japanese carriers, while still formidable, operated under the persistent shadow of Midway, balancing aggression with defensive caution. The battles became tests not only of hardware and skill but of doctrine, preparation, and psychological resilience. Air campaigns extended beyond direct fleet engagements. Control of the skies became essential for amphibious operations, naval gunfire support, and interdiction of supply lines. Carrier-based aircraft projected power across hundreds of miles, shaping the movement and deployment of both naval and land forces. Every sortie, reconnaissance mission, and bombing run was informed by the lessons learned at Midway, where intelligence, preparation, and timing had achieved decisive results. The struggle for supremacy was also a contest of attrition and adaptation. Both sides refined tactics, integrated new technologies, and adapted to enemy innovations. Yet Midway had permanently shifted the balance. American forces, benefiting from experience, morale, and strategic foresight, increasingly set the terms of engagement. Japan, constrained by caution and depleted veteran personnel, often found itself reacting to the evolving American initiative. In essence, the Pacific War after Midway became a chess match of strategy, skill, and psychology. Control of carriers, air superiority, intelligence integration, and mental fortitude determined who could seize the initiative and dictate the flow of battle. Each engagement, from the skies above fleet formations to the shores of contested islands, reflected the enduring influence of Midway, a battle whose lessons resonated across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific. Midway's significance transcended the immediate destruction of 4 Japanese carriers and thousands of soldiers lost. It was the point at which the balance of power in the Pacific irrevocably shifted, where strategy, intelligence, and psychology merged with courage and skill to create decisive outcomes. For the United States, the battle validated the integration of cryptography, reconnaissance, air superiority, and carrier-centric doctrine. It inspired innovation, fostered confidence, and demonstrated that even under daunting odds, well-prepared forces could seize initiative and dictate the course of a theater-wide conflict. For Japan, Midway was a painful lesson in vulnerability, overconfidence, and the consequences of underestimating an adaptive adversary. The battle forced defensive recalibration, exposed weaknesses in training and intelligence, and instilled caution that would shape every subsequent operation. More broadly, Midway redefined modern naval warfare. It proved that control of the seas depended not only on the number of ships or guns but on intelligence, coordination, and the human dimension of courage, morale, and decision-making under pressure. Fleets, aircraft, and submarines became instruments not merely of destruction but of strategic foresight and psychological influence. The Pacific War, culminating in Japan's surrender in 1945, was shaped in countless ways by the echoes of Midway. Every subsequent victory, every island captured, and every carrier engagement reflected the principles forged during those critical days in June 1942. Midway became more than a battle. It became a blueprint for victory, a testament to the enduring power of preparation, strategy, and human resolve. In the annals of history, the Battle of Midway remains a defining moment, a convergence of technology, tactics, intelligence, and human courage that altered the course of a war, reshaped naval doctrine, and left an indelible legacy on the Pacific theater.